Hello everyone, welcome to my new channel. I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. In the world of global entertainment, few intellectual properties are as coveted as The Three-Body Problem. The Hugo Award-winning science fiction trilogy, written by Liu Cixin, is a sprawling, complex epic that has captivated readers worldwide. It was seen as China's great contribution to modern sci-fi, a crown jewel of literary achievement. Bringing such a story to the screen was a monumental task, a challenge that promised immense prestige and profit. The man who held the keys to this universe was a 39-year-old visionary named Lin Kai. By 2020, Lin Kai, also known as Titan Lin, was at the apex of his career. As the founder, CEO, and chairman of Yuzu Games, he had built a global gaming empire from the ground up. He was a dynamic figure in China's tech industry, known for his sharp business acumen and ambitious vision. He saw the potential in The Three-Body Problem long before many others and spent years and a significant amount of capital to secure the rights, determined to shepherd it from the page to a global audience. His efforts culminated in the announcement that would shake the entertainment world. In September 2020, Yuzu Games had struck a landmark deal with Netflix to produce a high-budget series adaptation. It was the culmination of everything Lin Kai had worked for. The project was destined for success, and his name was attached as an executive producer. It was a moment of ultimate triumph. But within this story of ambition and success, a dark and meticulous plot of revenge was already taking root, engineered by a man who once stood by Lin Kai's side. To understand the tragedy that would unfold, we must go back to 2017. That was the year Lin Kai brought a man named Zhu Yao into the Yuzu family. On paper, Zhu Yao was the perfect hire. The same age as Lin, he was a member of China's educated elite, an accomplished lawyer with a glittering resume. He had studied law in France and at the prestigious University of Michigan in the United States. Before joining Yuzu, he held a significant position at Fosun Group, one of China's largest investment conglomerates. He was intelligent, methodical, and possessed a deep understanding of international corporate law and risk management. Initially, he was hired as Yuzu's chief of risk control, a vital role for a rapidly expanding company. Lin Kai was impressed by Zhu Yao's intellect and background, seeing him as a key player who could help professionalize the company and navigate complex international deals. The trust Lin Kai placed in Zhu Yao became fully apparent in 2018. When Yuzu established a new subsidiary specifically to manage the Three-Body Problem, EP, it was named the Three-Body Universe. This was not just another corporate division. It was the guardian of the company's most valuable asset. Lin Kai needed a leader for this venture, someone he believed had the sophistication and strategic mind to handle such a monumental task. He chose Zhu Yao, appointing him as the CEO of the Three-Body Universe. It was a massive vote of confidence. Zhu Yao was handed the responsibility of developing and commercializing the sci-fi epic, a project that was deeply personal to Lin Kai. For a time, the partnership seemed to be working. Zhu Yao, the careful and calculated lawyer, was tasked with transforming a literary masterpiece into a multi-billion-dollar franchise. However, as 2019 rolled into 2020, cracks began to appear in the foundation of their professional relationship. The pressure to deliver results with the valuable EP was immense, and according to sources within the company, Lin Kai grew increasingly dissatisfied with Zhu Yao's. The precise nature of their disagreements remained behind closed boardroom doors, but the consequences soon became public. Lin Kai began to systematically dismantle Zhu Yao's authority. Decisions that were once Zhu Yao's to make were now being deferred or overruled. A new executive, Jia Jialong, was brought into the fold and began taking over many of the responsibilities that had once belonged to the CEO of the Three-Body Universe. For Zhu Yao, this was more than just a corporate restructuring. It was a public demotion, a chipping away of his status and power within the empire he was supposed to help build. The humiliation was compounded by a severe financial blow. Zhu Yao, who had been earning a top-tier executive salary of 20 million Chinese yuan per year, saw his compensation slashed to approximately 4 million yuan. It was a staggering 80% pay cut. In the high-stakes world of Chinese tech executives, this was not just a loss of income. It was a clear and undeniable message. He was being sidelined, his value to the company drastically diminished in the eyes of its founder. The man who was once the trusted steward of the company's crown jewel was now being pushed to the margins. He watched as others, like Jia Jialong, were elevated, stepping into the roles and the spotlight he felt he rightfully deserved. The resentment began to fester, a quiet, cold anger building within the meticulous and intelligent lawyer. The final, unbearable insult came in September 2020 with the official announcement of the Netflix deal. As press releases went out and the industry buzzed with excitement, the list of executive producers for the Three Body Problem series was made public. The names on that list were Lin Kai, the company's founder, and Jia Jialong, the man who had effectively replaced. Zhu Yao's name was nowhere to be found. For him, this was the ultimate betrayal. He had been the CEO of the Three Body Universe, the entity in charge of the IP. In his mind, he had done the work, laid the groundwork, and was instrumental in the project's development. To be completely erased from its moment of greatest public triumph was more than an oversight. It was a deliberate act of erasure. His contributions, his status, his very presence in the project had been nullified. That for Zhu Yao was the point of no return. While the world celebrated the news, Zhu Yao began to plot his revenge. His brilliant, methodical mind, once used for corporate law and risk management, was now redirected to a much darker purpose. He became obsessed with the American television series Breaking Bad, in which a brilliant chemist uses his knowledge to become a ruthless criminal mastermind. He saw a parallel. He decided that his revenge would not be loud or violent in a conventional sense. It would be quiet, calculated, and scientific. It would be a reflection of his own intelligence and meticulousness. He began to research toxicology, diving into the dark corners of the internet to learn about poisons. Using the anonymity of the dark web and a staggering 160 different cell phone numbers, he started purchasing a vast array of deadly chemicals. His plan was not a singular act of passion but a long, systematic campaign. He would not just eliminate the source of his humiliation. He would terrorize those he felt had wronged him, making them suffer slowly. In a quiet, rented apartment in Shanghai's suburban Qingpu district, far from the gleaming Yuzhou headquarters, he began to build a secret, sophisticated laboratory. There, surrounded by beakers, chemical compounds, and scientific equipment, the elite lawyer began his transformation into a cold-blooded poisoner. The first targets of his experiments would not be his primary objective, but rather the colleagues he held in contempt, starting with the man who took his place, Jia Jialong. The stage was set for a tragedy born from corporate ambition and wounded pride. Zhu Yao's campaign of revenge began not with a bang, but with a whisper. From September to December of 2020, while the executives at Yuzhou were busy with the Netflix deal, a sinister experiment was unfolding within their own offices. Zhu Yao, still showing up to work every day, began to systematically poison his secondary targets. He leveraged his continued access to the company's facilities to carry out his attacks. His methods were subtle, designed to inflict illness and confusion rather than immediate death. He would taint communal beverages, adding his carefully prepared toxins to coffee pots, bottles of whiskey, and water dispensers in the office. His primary target in this initial phase was Jia Jialong, the man he saw as his direct usurper. But the poison was indiscriminate. At least 3 other employees also became his victims. The symptoms were baffling and chronic. These individuals, including Jia Jialong and even his wife, began suffering from a range of debilitating health issues. Doctors were puzzled. The cause was eventually traced to chronic mercury poisoning, but its source was a mystery. Within the gleaming, modern headquarters of a billion-dollar tech company, a quiet and invisible terror was taking hold, orchestrated by one of their own senior executives. This phase served a dual purpose for Zhu Yao. It was an act of retribution against those he despised, and a cruel series of trials to test the efficacy of his poisons on human subjects before deploying them on his ultimate target. Having refined his methods, Zhu Yao decided it was time to strike at the king. For Lin Kai, he knew a different approach was needed. Poisoning a shared coffee pot was too risky and uncertain. He needed a direct and guaranteed delivery method. His research led him to a solution that was both diabolically clever and deeply cynical. He knew that Lin Kai, like many high-powered executives, was health-conscious and regularly used supplements. Zhu Yao prepared a box of high-end probiotics, a product associated with wellness and vitality. But inside this gift of health, he concealed a weapon of death. He carefully replaced one or more of the probiotic capsules with his own creation. These capsules were filled with a lethal cocktail of toxins he had perfected in his secret lab, a blend that included, among other things, deadly mercury chloride and tetrodotoxin, the potent neurotoxin found in pufferfish. This combination was designed to be incredibly difficult to diagnose and even harder to treat, ensuring it would cause a painful and systematic breakdown of the body's function. Sometime around the 14th or 15th of December, 2020, Zhu Ya presented the box of poisoned probiotics to Lin Kai, likely masking it as a thoughtful gesture, a gift of goodwill from a colleague. Lin Kai, unsuspecting, accepted it. On the afternoon of December 16th, Lin Kai finished his workday at the Yuzu headquarters and went home. Shortly after, he began to feel unwell. The initial symptoms were likely nausea and sharp abdominal pain, which he may have dismissed as a stomach bug or food poisoning. As a man in his prime, he attempted to treat himself at home, having no reason to suspect the true, sinister nature of his illness. But the poison cocktail was now coursing through his system, beginning its devastating assault on his internal organs and central nervous system. His condition did not improve, it worsened dramatically. By the next day, December 17th, the symptoms had become so severe that he had to be rushed to Huashan Hospital in Shanghai. The medical team was immediately faced with a critical and perplexing case. Here was a healthy 39-year-old man, a titan of the tech industry, who was experiencing a rapid and catastrophic physical decline. The doctors ran a battery of tests, trying to identify the cause. As they analyzed the results, they recognized the signs of acute poisoning. The specific markers pointed towards a massive dose of heavy metals, particularly mercury. Realizing they were not dealing with a simple medical emergency, but the result of a deliberate criminal act, the hospital staff made a fateful decision. At approximately 5 p.m. that evening, they contacted the Shanghai police. The police response was swift and decisive. As soon as the report came in from the hospital, an investigative team was dispatched. Detectives went to the hospital to speak with the medical staff and secure any initial evidence. Simultaneously, another team was sent to the Yuzu headquarters to seal off potential crime scenes and begin the process of untangling the victim's personal and professional life. In a high-profile case like this, involving a billionaire CEO, the pressure was immense. Investigators began interviewing employees, board members, and anyone close to Lin Kai. They were looking for a motive, for any sign of conflict or animosity that could lead to such a heinous act. It did not take them long to find one. As they mapped out the internal power dynamics of the company, one name repeatedly emerged from the background of corporate disagreements: Zhu Ya. His story was a classic recipe for motive. A once trusted executive who had been publicly demoted, his salary slashed, ultimately erased from the company's landmark. The timeline of his falling out with Lin Kai coincided perfectly with the timeline of the crime. The suspicion fell on him almost immediately. Based on the compelling motive, the Shanghai police took action. On December 18th, just one day after Lin Kai had been admitted to the hospital, detectives located and arrested Zhu Ya. His capture was remarkably fast, a testament to the clarity of his motive. While the prime suspect was in custody, the victim was fighting a losing battle for his life. In an attempt to manage public perception and prevent panic among investors, Yuzu Games released an official statement on December 23rd. The announcement claimed that Lin Kai was in the hospital due to health reasons, but that his condition was stable and improving. This was a fabrication. In reality, his situation was dire. The poison cocktail had caused irreversible damage. His organs were shutting down one by one. Doctors at Huashan Hospital threw everything they had at trying to save him. In a desperate attempt to flush the toxins from his system and counteract their effects, they performed massive blood transfusions, cycling more than 40 liters of new blood through his body. But the poison was too potent and had had too much time to do its work. Despite the monumental efforts of the medical team, Lin Kai's body could not recover. On December 25, 2020, Christmas Day, the 39-year-old founder of Yuzu Games died from multiple organ failure. The news of his death was announced by the company that evening. It sent a shockwave not only through the Chinese tech and gaming industries but across the global entertainment world. A brilliant and ambitious entrepreneur, at the very height of his success, had been murdered. The method was not a gun or a knife, but a silent, invisible poison, delivered by a man he had once trusted with his greatest ambition. With the victim gone and the primary suspect in custody, the police investigation now shifted to a new phase, uncovering the full, horrifying extent of Zhu Ya's meticulous and cold-blooded plot. They needed to find the evidence to prove that the brilliant lawyer was, in fact, a ruthless killer. With Zhu Ya in custody, investigators faced a strange and frustrating challenge. They had their man. The motive was clear, the timing was perfect, but the suspect himself was a black box. Leveraging his extensive legal knowledge, Zhu Ya remained calm, composed, and almost completely silent during interrogations. He refused to confess, offering no information, no emotional outburst, no crack in his stoic facade. He knew his rights, and he used them to obstruct the investigation at every turn. He was an uncooperative and defiant prisoner. The police were convinced he was the killer, but his silence meant they would have to build their case on physical evidence alone. They needed to find the source of the poison, the murder weapon, and the link that tied it all directly to him. The search for concrete proof began. Detectives executed search warrants on Zhu Ya's home, his office at Yuzhou, and any property associated with him. The initial searches yielded some useful digital evidence, but no smoking gun. There were no vials of poison in his desk, no incriminating documents left in plain sight. He was far too careful for that. But investigators were meticulous. They dug into his financial records, his rental agreements, and his digital footprint, looking for any anomaly, any location he frequented that was outside his normal routine. Their persistence paid off. They discovered that Zhu Ya had been renting a nondescript apartment in the suburban Qingpu district, a location far from his home and with no obvious connection to his work or personal life. It was a major red flag. A team was immediately dispatched to the address, not knowing what they would find. When the investigators entered the apartment, they were met with a scene that was more shocking than any of them could have imagined. This was no ordinary residence. It was a fully equipped, clandestine chemistry laboratory. The space was filled with beakers, flasks, distillation equipment, and a vast array of chemical containers. It was a scene straight out of Breaking Bad, the very show Zhu Ya had reportedly been obsessed with. He had transformed this anonymous apartment into his personal poison factory. This was the breakthrough the case desperately needed. The discovery of the lab was the physical manifestation of his dark and twisted plan, undeniable proof of his premeditation. The police now had the heart of his entire operation. The sheer scale of what they found in the lab was staggering. This was not the work of an amateur. It was a sophisticated and highly organized setup. As forensic teams carefully cataloged the evidence, they found traces and samples of more than 100 different types of poison. Zhu Ya had not just purchased a single substance. He had acquired a horrifying arsenal of toxins from the dark web and had been systematically experimenting with them. He had kept detailed notes, like a macabre scientist, documenting different chemical formulas, their preparation methods, and their observed effects. His plan was not just to kill, but to do so with a twisted sense of scientific perfection, creating a signature poison that would be nearly impossible for doctors to identify and treat in time. The lab was his sanctuary and his workshop, where his intelligence and methodical nature were weaponized. Among the most disturbing pieces of evidence discovered were the remnants of his experiment. To test the potency and reaction times of his toxic cocktails before using them on his human colleagues, Zhu Ya had used living subjects. Investigators found evidence that he had poisoned and killed household pets, including dogs and cats. This detail revealed a profound level of cruelty and a complete lack of empathy. He was not just a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. He was a cold, calculating individual willing to inflict suffering on helpless animals to perfect his instruments of death. This act of animal cruelty painted a chilling psychological portrait of the suspect, showcasing a man utterly detached from the value of life, whether human or animal. While the physical evidence from the lab was overwhelming, the digital forensic teams were simultaneously piecing together Zhu Ya's secret life online. By analyzing his computers and phones, they uncovered his extensive search history, which was filled with queries about toxicology, chemical suppliers, and methods for bypassing online security. They found the digital breadcrumbs that led back to his purchases on the dark web, confirming how he had acquired his vast chemical inventory. Most impressively, they uncovered his use of over 160 different mobile phone numbers, a sophisticated tactic to anonymize his communications and transactions, making them nearly untraceable. He had applied the same level of caution and meticulousness he once used for corporate risk management to concealing his criminal activities. The final step was to scientifically link the poisons from Zhu Ya's lab to the victim. Forensic toxicologists analyzed the samples taken from the lab and compared them with the results of Lin Kai's autopsy and the blood tests of the surviving victims. They found a definitive match. The unique and complex chemical signature of the poison cocktail found in Lin Kai's body was identical to the substances Zhu Ya had been creating in his secret apartment. The mercury that had been slowly sickening Jia Jialong and the other employees were also traced back to chemicals found in the lab. The science was irrefutable. His silence no longer mattered. The evidence screamed his guilt. The police now had a complete and terrifying picture of the crime. This was no impulsive act. It was a long-term, carefully researched, and flawlessly executed plot. Zhu Yao had spent months acquiring his materials, testing his formulas, and systematically poisoning his colleagues, all while maintaining the facade of a normal, high-level executive. With this mountain of irrefutable physical and digital evidence, the prosecution formally indicted Zhu Yao for the murder of Lin Kai and for endangering public safety by poisoning 4 other individuals. The stage was now set for a trial where the dark genius of a spurned lawyer would be laid bare before the world. On October 31, 2023, nearly 3 years after Lin Kai's death, Zhu Yao stood trial at the Shanghai No. 1 Intermediate People's Court. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision, presenting the mountain of evidence that investigators had painstakingly assembled. They began with the motive, detailing the timeline of Zhu Yao's demotion, his drastic pay cut, and his ultimate erasure from the Netflix project. They established a clear and powerful narrative of professional jealousy and a deep-seated desire for revenge. Then, they presented their physical. The courtroom was told of the clandestine laboratory in the Qingpu district apartment, a virtual factory for death. Jurors heard about the more than 100 different poisons, the scientific equipment, and the chilling notes that documented his research. They presented the findings of the digital forensics team, revealing his dark web purchases and his use of over 160 phone numbers to cover his track. The prosecution also detailed the cruel experiments on animals, painting a picture of a man devoid of empathy. Finally, they presented the irrefutable scientific link, the unique chemical cocktail found in Lin Kai's body, which perfectly matched the substances concocted in Zhu Yao's lab. Through it all, Zhu Yao remained impassive. He offered no testimony, no defense, no remorse. He, the expert in law, chose to remain silent, a final act of defiance against the system he was once part of. His lack of cooperation did him no favors. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, speaking far louder than he ever could. The verdict came down on March 22, 2024. The court found Zhu Yao guilty on all charges. He was convicted of the intentional murder of Lin Kai. He was also found guilty of a separate charge, endangering public safety, for the systematic poisoning of his 4 other colleagues. In its final judgment, the court described his actions with scathing condemnation. His methods were labeled extremely despicable, his motive ignoble, and his crimes a demonstration of extreme inhumanity. The sentence reflected the court's view of the heinous nature of the crime. For the murder of Lin Kai, Zhu Yao was sentenced to death. For the crime of endangering public safety, he received a 6-year prison sentence. Under Chinese law, the penalties were consolidated into the most severe one. The final judgment was death, and the permanent deprivation of his political rights. The legal chapter of the saga was closed. The brilliant lawyer who had turned his mind to murder was now condemned to pay the ultimate price for his actions. The fallout from the crime, however, continued to ripple outward, leaving a trail of devastation. For Yuzu Games, the company Lin Kai had built from nothing, the impact was catastrophic. The sudden and violent death of its founder and visionary leader created a massive power vacuum, throwing the company into a state of crisis. In the immediate aftermath, Yuzu's stock price plummeted, at one point losing 18% of its value and wiping out a fortune for investors. Beyond the financial loss, the company's reputation was deeply scarred. The story of a boardroom dispute escalating into a real-life, Breaking Bad, poisoning plot became a dark cloud that hung over the brand. The project that was meant to be Lin Kai's crowning achievement, the Netflix adaptation of The Three-Body Problem, was also thrown into uncertainty. Although the production moved forward, it did so under the shadow of its executive-produced murder. When the series was finally released, Lin Kai's name appeared in the credits, a somber, posthumous tribute to the man whose ambition had made it all possible. And for his family, the consequences were the most profound. His 3 young children inherited his vast, billion-dollar estate, but lost their father forever. The case of Zhu Yao and Lin Kai serves as a chilling modern parable about the dark side of ambition. It is a textbook example of what psychologists sometimes refer to as elite crime, where individuals with immense intelligence, education, and social standing use their gifts not for creation, but for destruction. Zhu Yao did not resort to crude violence. Instead, he weaponized his intellect, turning his methodical mind into an instrument of terror. His high self-regard, likely bordering on narcissism, could not withstand the blow of being sidelined. In his mind, the demotion and public snub were not just a career setback, but an existential insult to his very being, an offense that could only be paid for with death. Even with the verdict, some questions remain unanswered. adding to the case's mystique. Was he truly acting alone in sourcing such a vast quantity of dangerous chemicals? And what was the precise purpose of poisoning the other 4 employees? Was it merely a series of dress rehearsals to test his methods, or was each one a separate, calculated act of revenge against anyone he perceived as an enemy? The exact, complex formula of the poison cocktail that killed Lin Kai is a secret that likely died with its creator's conviction, a final piece of his twisted intellectual. Ultimately, the story is a horrifying reminder that behind the gleaming facades of corporate success, the most ancient and venomous human emotions, envy, pride, and hatred, can fester. It shows how a brilliant mind, when corrupted by a wounded ego, can become the most dangerous weapon of all. Case 2. In the autumn of 1994, the campus of Tsinghua University in Beijing was a world of boundless promise. Within its prestigious halls, the brightest young minds in China pursued their futures. And among them, few were brighter or more promising than Zhu Ling. At 20 years old, she was a sophomore in the highly competitive physical chemistry department, a field that demanded precision, intellect, and dedication. But Zhu Ling was more than just brilliance. She was a constellation of talents, a young woman who seemed to excel at everything she touched. Her friends and family remember her as radiant, with long, dark hair and a healthy, athletic build honed by years of competitive swimming. She was a decorated athlete, holding the title of a Beijing-level Roman II swimmer. But her true passion, the one that illuminated her soul. Zhu Ling was a gifted musician, proficient with the piano, but her mastery of the ancient Chinese instrument, the gyukin, was what set her apart. She was a star member of the university's traditional music orchestra, her performances filled with a grace and skill that captivated audiences. In the eyes of her peers, she was the epitome of the perfect daughter, talented, intelligent, beautiful, and kind, without a trace of arrogance. She was the kind of person for whom the future seemed to hold nothing but success. Her family, a small, tight-knit unit, was her foundation. Both her father, Wu Chengjai, and her mother, Zhu Mingxin, were senior engineers, people of science and logic. They had already endured an unspeakable tragedy years earlier. April of 1989, their older daughter, Wu Jin, a student at the equally prestigious Peking University, had passed away during a spring outing. The loss was immense, and it made their bond with their surviving daughter, Zhu Ling, even more precious. They watched her grow and flourish at Tsinghua with immense pride. In her dormitory, Zhu Ling shared a room with several other young women from her chemistry class. Among them was a student named Sun Wai. Like Zhu Ling, Sun Wai was also a member of the university orchestra. They shared the same academic pressures, the same musical interests, and the same small living space. Their lives were intertwined, as is common for university roommates, a daily existence of shared meals, late-night study sessions, and quiet conversations. The calm rhythm of this promising life began to falter in late November 1994. The first sign was subtle, easily dismissed as stress or a common bug. On November 24th, her 21st birthday, Zhu Ling started experiencing sharp, debilitating pains in her stomach. She lost her appetite completely. The pain persisted for days, a constant, unwelcome companion. Then came the second, more alarming symptom. In early December, her long, beautiful hair began to fall out. At first, it was just a few strands, but soon it was coming out in alarming clumps. Despite the growing illness, Zhu Ling was determined not to let it interfere with her commitments. On December 11th, she was scheduled to perform a solo piece at a concert for the Tsinghua Orchestra at the Beijing Concert Hall. She refused to back down. By this point, her vision had started to blur, and her eyes ached, forcing her to wear glasses, but she walked onto the stage with her gyukin. She performed a haunting, ancient melody called Guangling San. The audience saw a poised and talented young musician. They couldn't see the intense pain she was enduring, nor could they know the secret battle her body was fighting. It was the last time she would ever perform in public. In the days following the concert, the mysterious illness attacked with renewed vengeance. All of her hair fell out, leaving her completely bald. On December 23rd, with her symptoms worsening, her parents had her admitted to the Tongren Hospital in Beijing. The doctors were perplexed. They ran a battery of tests, but the results provided no clear answers. They saw the symptoms, the abdominal pain, the hair loss, the neurological issues, but they couldn't identify the underlying cause. For a month, Zhu Ling remained in the hospital, her condition a frustrating medical mystery. Then slowly, something shifted. Her body seemed to be fighting back. The pain subsided, and she began to feel stronger. Though the doctors never found a definitive cause, her condition improved enough that on January 23, 1995, she was discharged. She spent the next month recuperating at home. On February 20th, the new semester began at Tsinghua, and Zhu Ling, feeling much better, returned to her classes in her dormitory. For a week, it seemed as though the nightmare was over, that whatever had afflicted her was a bizarre, one-time event. But the reprieve was tragically short-lived. On February 27th, just 7 days after her return, the symptoms came roaring back. This time, they were different and far more terrifying. She was struck by an excruciating pain in both of her legs. It was a deep, relentless ache that made walking unbearable. Her condition deteriorated at a frightening speed. By March 6th, the pain had become so severe that it had spread to her lower back, and she was overcome with constant dizziness. Realizing this was far more serious than before, her parents rushed her to one of the best hospitals in the country, the Peking Union Medical College Hospital, or PUMH. There, she came under the care of Professor Lai Shunwei, a neurologist. After examining Zhu Ling and reviewing her strange collection of symptoms, the hair loss, the gastrointestinal distress, and now the intense neurological pain, a memory sparked in the professor's mind. He had seen something similar once before, back in the 1960s. He voiced a chilling suspicion. This looked like a case of heavy metal poisoning. Specifically, he suspected thallium. Thallium is a soft, bluish-white metal, but its salts are famously toxic. Colorless, odorless, and tasteless, they dissolve easily in water, making them a historically notorious poison. The professor's hypothesis was a crucial leap forward, a potential key to solving the mystery. But this promising lead was almost immediately shut down. The hospital consulted with Zhu Ling's own chemistry department at Tsinghua University. The university officials were firm. Thallium was a strictly controlled substance. Only a handful of professors and senior students involved in specific research projects had access to it. Zhu Ling herself, when asked, confirmed that her own studies and lab work never involved any contact with thallium or its compounds. Based on these assurances, the doctors at PUMH dismissed the thallium poisoning theory. Instead, they moved toward a different diagnosis, Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's a rare autoimmune disorder where the body's immune system mistakenly attacks its own nerves, leading to pain, numbness, and eventually paralysis. The symptoms fit, and it seemed like a plausible, if tragic, explanation. But it was the wrong one. While the medical team pursued this incorrect diagnosis, the real poison continued its silent, devastating work inside Zhu Ling's body. Her condition became increasingly critical. On March 28, 1995, her body finally gave out. She stopped breathing. Doctors rushed to save her, placing her on a ventilator, but she had already slipped into a deep, unresponsive coma. The brilliant, vibrant musician lay still and silent in a hospital bed, her life hanging by a thread, while the true cause of her illness remained an undiagnosed and undetected act of malice. Zhu Ling lay in a coma, her body kept alive by the steady rhythm of a ventilator. At the prestigious Peking Union Medical College Hospital, her doctors treated her for Guillain-Barré syndrome, unaware that the real enemy, a heavy metal poison, was still present in her system, continuing its relentless assault on her central nervous system. Every passing day was causing more irreversible damage. Her friends and family could only watch in helpless agony as the vibrant young woman they knew slipped further away. But among her circle of friends, a desperate idea began to form, one that would change the course of the case and demonstrate the nascent power of a technology that was, in 1995, still a novelty in China. One of her high school friends, a student at Peking University named Bi Jisheng, refused to accept the hospital's diagnosis. He watched as Zhu Ling's condition failed to improve, and felt a growing conviction that the doctors were missing something vital. Conventional medicine had hit a wall. So, he and a small group of friends decided to turn to an unconventional source for help, the global community of the internet. It's hard to overstate how revolutionary this idea was at the time. In 1995, the internet in China was not the sprawling, accessible network we know today. It was a text-based frontier, a collection of email systems and forums called newsgroups, accessible to only a handful of academics and universities. The World Wide Web was in its infancy. For most people, the concept of sending a message across the globe and receiving an instant reply was science fiction. But for Bi Jisheng and his friends, it was the last hope they had. On April 10, 1995, they embarked on their mission. They painstakingly gathered all of Zhu Ling's medical records, every symptom, from the initial stomach pains to the final coma, every doctor's note, every ambiguous test result. They translated the entire complex medical history into English. Then, they composed a message, an open letter titled "Sauce, Help for its Tsinghua University Student," and posted it to a number of medical news groups, sending their plea for help out into the digital darkness. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Their message traveled across the globe at the speed of light, appearing on computer screens in hospitals, universities, and research labs. Within emails began to pour in, then dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Medical experts from the United States, Europe, Australia, and beyond, toxicologists, neurologists, and physicians read the detailed account of Zhu Ling's symptoms, and an astonishing consensus began to emerge. Email after email pointed to the same conclusion, the very one Professor Lai had first suspected and that had been dismissed. The symptoms were a textbook case, a classic presentation of thallium poisoning. From across the world, a chorus of expert voices was shouting the answer that the doctors in Beijing had failed to see. Armed with a mountain of emails, the students presented this evidence to the physicians at PUM. Initially, there was resistance. The hospital was a pillar of the Chinese medical establishment, and the idea of accepting a diagnosis sourced from an anonymous, global network of strangers on the internet was met with skepticism. But Zhu Ling's parents, not clinging to this new, tangible hope, were relentless. They pressured the hospital, demanding that they test their daughter for thallium. The evidence was simply too overwhelming to ignore. Finally, the hospital conceded. On April 28, they collected fresh samples of Zhu Ling's blood, urine, hair, and even the fluid from her spine. They sent them to the Beijing Institute for Occupational Disease Prevention and Treatment, a facility with the specialized equipment needed for toxicological analysis. The results came back the same day. They were definitive, and they were horrifying. Zhu Ling's body was saturated with thallium. The concentration of the poison was thousands of times higher than a fatal dose. The analysis of her hair, which grows at a predictable rate, revealed something even more sinister. It showed two distinct periods of exposure. The first was a smaller, sublethal dose that corresponded perfectly with her first mysterious illness in the winter of 1994. The second was a massive, overwhelming dose that aligned with her catastrophic relapse and coma in March of 1995. The conclusion was inescapable. This was not an accident. This was not an environmental exposure. This was a methodical, calculated, and repeated attempt to murder her. The medical mystery was now officially a criminal investigation. That very evening, as soon as they received the lab report, Zhu Ling's parents went directly to the Beijing Public Security Bureau and filed a police report. The case was now in the hands of the law. The next morning, April 29th, the family made a crucial phone call to the administration at Tsinghua University. They explained that their daughter had been deliberately poisoned and begged the officials to secure her dormitory room. The poison, they reasoned, must have been administered there in her food, her water, her cosmetics. Her belongings were now the most critical evidence in a major criminal case. They pleaded with the university to seal the room and protect the crime scene. But the university did not act immediately. Whether due to bureaucratic red tape, a failure to grasp the urgency, or some other reason, the request was not fulfilled. This inaction proved to be catastrophic, because the timing could not have been worse. The 1st of May was the start of the International Labor Day holiday, a long weekend when the campus would be largely deserted. This holiday provided a perfect window of opportunity. During that break, while the campus was quiet, a strange burglary took place in Zhu Ling's dorm, but the thief wasn't interested in valuables like money or electronics. Instead, only a specific set of items went missing: Zhu Ling's personal effects, her water cup, her chopsticks and bowl, her makeup, and all her toiletries. In short, every single item that she used to eat, drink, or apply to her skin. Every potential vehicle for a colorless, tasteless, water-soluble poison had vanished. In one clean, calculated act, the crime scene was wiped clean. The police investigation had been sabotaged before it had even begun. The most direct physical evidence, the key to identifying the poisoner, was now gone forever, leaving investigators with a confirmed poisoning but no weapon, no point of contact, and a crime scene that had been sanitized with chilling precision. While Zhu Ling's life was being saved by a global, digital effort, the police investigation in Beijing was facing a brick wall. The crime scene had been deliberately and methodically destroyed, robbing them of the direct physical evidence needed to secure a conviction. With no contaminated objects, investigators were forced to rely on logic and circumstantial evidence. They began by asking two fundamental questions. First, who had access to the weapon? And second, who had the opportunity to use it? Thallium salts are not a common substance. They are highly toxic and strictly regulated chemicals. Within Tsinghua University, access was limited to a very small, identifiable number of faculty and students engaged in specific, high-level research. The police knew that the poisoner had to be someone on that short list. The second question narrowed the field even further. Who had the intimate, daily proximity to Zhu Ling to administer poison on 2 separate occasions, months apart, without raising any suspicion? The answer couldn't be a stranger or a casual acquaintance. It had to be someone inside her innermost circle, someone who shared her living space and her daily routines. When the investigators looked at the intersection of those 2 criteria, access to thallium and the opportunity to poison, one name rose to the surface. Sun Wai, Zhu Ling's classmate and roommate. The circumstantial case against her was compelling. First, and most importantly, she was the only undergraduate student in their class who was officially involved in a research project that gave her legitimate, documented access to thallium salts. Her own research advisor would later confirm this fact. This placed the murder weapon directly within her grasp. Second, her position as a roommate gave her unfettered opportunity. She could have easily tampered with Zhu Ling's water bottle, her teacup, her food, or even her cosmetics, day after day, with little to no chance of being observed. With access and opportunity established, the investigators considered the question of motive. While there was no overt, documented conflict between the 2 young women, the prevailing theory, held by many of their classmates and the public, was simple, powerful, and timeless: jealousy. Zhu Ling was a star who shone brightly in every aspect of university life. She was academically gifted, musically talented, beautiful, and popular. Sun Wai, by contrast, was described as being more introverted and reserved, living in the shadow of her brilliant roommate. There were rumors of professional rivalry as well. Some classmates claimed that there had been a competition for a coveted performance role in the university orchestra, a role that Zhu Ling ultimately won over Sun Wai. In this context, the poisoning was seen as a dark and vicious act of resentment, an attempt to extinguish the light that Sun Wai felt overshadowed by. Despite this clear and logical line of inquiry, the official investigation proceeded at a bafflingly slow pace. Inexplicably, it took the Beijing police almost 2 full years before they formally brought Sun Wai in for questioning. On April 2, 1997, nearly 2 years after the poisoning was confirmed and the crime was reported, the primary, and, by all accounts, only suspect was finally interrogated. The questioning lasted for 8 days. Sun Wai denied any and all involvement in the poisoning. Afterwards, her family was called, and she was released on bail. It was the first and the last time she was ever officially questioned by the. This shocking delay and the lack of any further action raised an immediate and troubling question. Why? To many observers, and especially to Zhu Ling's family, the answer lay in Sun Wai's powerful family background. Sun Wai was not from an ordinary family. She was the granddaughter and niece of high-ranking officials in the Chinese government. Her grandfather, Sun Yueki, was a significant political figure, a senior member of a major national. Her uncle, Sun Fuling, had served as the vice mayor of Beijing for a decade. In a society where personal connections and influence known as guangxi can be incredibly powerful, the family's status was seen as a shield. The public widely believed that these connections were used to interfere with the investigation, creating the delays, ensuring the interrogation was a one-time event, and ultimately pressuring the police to drop the case. And in 1998, that is exactly what happened. The Beijing police formally notified Zhu Ling's parents that the investigation was closed. The official reason given was a lack of sufficient evidence to charge any individual. The destroyed crime scene had done its job. Without a contaminated object to serve as a smoking gun, the case against Sun Wai, however logical, remained circumstantial. The authorities claim they simply could not. For Zhu Ling's family, the news was a final, soul-crushing blow. Their daughter had been stolen from them, and now, a hope for any legal justice was gone. While the wheels of justice were grinding to a halt, the wheels of medicine had been turning. After the thallium diagnosis was finally confirmed in late April 1995, doctors immediately began administering the only known effective antidote, a chemical compound called Prussian blue. This substance works by binding to the thallium ions within the body, trapping them and allowing them to be safely flushed out of the system. It was a race against time to remove the poison before it could inflict any more damage. For 5 long months, Zhu Ling remained in a coma, her body a battlefield between the poison and the antidote. Finally, on August 31, 1995, she opened her eyes. She had survived, but the vibrant young woman who had entered the hospital was gone forever. Waking from the coma was not a return to her life, but the beginning of a new, cruelly circumscribed existence. The thallium had been in her system for too long, and the damage to her brain and central nervous system was catastrophic and permanent. She was left legally blind. Her lungs were severely damaged, and her limbs were atrophied. The poison had wiped away her higher cognitive functions, leaving her with the mental capacity of a 6-year-old child. She could no longer walk, no longer care for herself, no longer play the music she loved. The brilliant student and gifted musician was now trapped inside a broken body, entirely dependent on her aging parents for every aspect of her daily care. Zhu had woken up, but her life, as she knew it, was over. The legal case was closed, the suspect was free, and the victim was left to serve a life sentence of pain and disability. The official case file on the poisoning of Zhu was closed in 1998, relegated to a dusty shelf in a police archive. But the story itself refused to die. It lived on in the memories of her friends, in the unending grief of her parents, and, most powerfully, in the burgeoning public square of the Chinese internet. For years, it was a story told in whispers in online forums, a symbol of justice denied. Then, in 2005, the case exploded back into the public consciousness, and the catalyst, ironically, was the primary suspect herself. Using the screen name, Sun Y Statement, a person claiming to be Sun Y posted a long, elaborate letter on Tianhe Club, one of China's most popular online forums. In the post, she vehemently declared her innocent. She claimed that the university's management of toxic chemicals was notoriously lax, and that she was far from the only person who could have gained access to thallium. She insisted that the police had officially cleared her of all suspicion back in 1998 and portrayed herself as the true victim, a person whose life had been ruined by a relentless and baseless online witch hunt. Her intention may have been to silence the accusations for good, but her post had the exact opposite effect. It was a match thrown on dry tinder. The case was introduced to a new, much larger generation of Chinese netizens. The post went viral, and a firestorm of debate and amateur investigation erupted. Thousands of people dissected every detail of the case, unearthing old news articles, sharing anecdotes, and analyzing the known facts. Sun Y's attempt to control the narrative failed spectacularly. Instead, it cemented her status in the public mind as the unpunished perpetrator. The online furor grew. The following year, in 2006, an anonymous hacker claimed to have accessed Sun Y's email accounts, leaking what they alleged were messages between her and her friends discussing how to handle the public relations crisis. Though the authenticity of these emails was never verified, they added more fuel to the fire, painting a picture of a calculated effort to deflect blame. Adding to the mystery was the pervasive silence from many of Zhu other classmates and roommates. Over the years, most of them refused to speak to journalists or investigators, a collective silence that the public interpreted as a sign of fear, suggesting they had been pressured or threatened into not talking. Meanwhile, Sun Y had moved on. After graduating from Tsinghua, she worked for a time at Nokia China. She eventually married, emigrated to the United States, and became an American citizen. She even changed her name from Sun Y to Sun Xian. To Chinese speakers, the name change was particularly galling. The new character in her name, Shi, can mean to release or to be set free. For millions following the case, this was seen as a quiet, taunting admission, a symbolic boast that she had escaped. The image of the suspect living a comfortable, anonymous life in America stood in stark, infuriating contrast to the daily reality of Zhu, who remained trapped and suffering in Beijing. Then, in 2013, the case roared back to life with international implications. A nearly identical poisoning case at Shanghai's Fudan University shocked the nation and immediately brought Zhu story to the forefront once again. This time, the public anger transcended China's borders. Activists in the Chinese-American community created an online petition on the White House's official We the People website. The petition demanded that the United States government investigate Sun Y's status and deport her for her alleged role in the poisoning. The response was unprecedented. The petition exploded online, gathering more than 150,000 signatures in a matter of days, easily surpassing the threshold needed to require an official response from the U.S. government. The story was picked up by major international news outlets, and for the first time, the nearly 2-decade-old case of a poisoned student in Beijing was global. The immense pressure forced the authorities in China to break their long silence. The Beijing Public Security Bureau issued a formal statement on their social media account. They acknowledged the public's enduring passion for the case but stood by their decision to close it. They admitted there had been shortcomings in the original investigation, blaming the delayed reporting of the crime and the limits of forensic technology at the time. It was a rare admission of failure, but also a definitive statement. The case would not be reopened. Justice, through official channels, was truly dead. For nearly 30 years after the poisoning, Zhu Ling's life was a testament to the crime's devastating consequences. Her parents, Wu Chengjia and Zhu Mingxin, by then in their 70s and 80s, dedicated the remainder of their lives to being her full-time caregiver. Their unwavering devotion was a portrait of profound love, but also a constant, living reminder of the justice they were never granted. On December 22, 2023, Zhu Ling's long vow finally came to an end. She passed away at the age of 50, her death closing a chapter of nearly 3 decades of pain and suffering. The legacy of her case is deep and complex. It created a crisis of faith in the Chinese legal system, cementing a widespread belief that power and influence can place an individual above the law. But it also became a landmark moment in the history of the Chinese internet. It demonstrated that even when official channels fail, the public can use technology to serve as a collective memory, a court of public opinion that refuses to let a story be forgotten. Though no court ever convicted her, in the minds of millions in China and around the world, the verdict on the main suspect was rendered long ago. And so, the case remains eternally suspended, legally unsolved, yet morally certain. Many haunting questions linger. Who was the mysterious thief that so perfectly sanitized the crime scene? What was the full extent of the family's intervention? And why was a 2-year delay allowed before the only logical suspect was even questioned? These are questions that will likely never have official answer. All that is left is the tragic memory of a brilliant young woman, and the faint, symbolic echo of her final performance, a melody called Guangling San, an ancient song forever associated with a story of being unjustly condemned. Case 3. The evening of September 6, 2011, in the city of Luoyang, a sprawling urban center in China's Henan province. For most of its residents, it was just another Tuesday. The sounds of traffic, the smell of street food, the gentle hum of a city settling down for the night. But for one 24-year-old woman, the simple act of breathing the cool night air was a shocking, terrifying, and profound experience. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she was outside. She was not in the damp, foul-smelling darkness she had been forced to call home. She was on a public street, surrounded by the world she thought she had lost forever. Her captor was with her. The man who had imprisoned her, who controlled every aspect of her existence, from the food she ate to the air she breathed, had made a mistake. It was a fatal error in judgment, born from an arrogance that had been allowed to fester, unchecked, for years. He had brought her out of the dungeon, intending to force her into prostitution to earn money for him. He believed he had broken her spirit completely, that she was now a compliant tool for his use. He was wrong. For a single, critical moment, his attention was diverted. Perhaps he was looking at his phone, or speaking to someone, or simply lost in his own thoughts. The details are lost, but the opportunity was not. For the woman, whose senses were overwhelmed by the sudden reintroduction to freedom, a primal instinct surged through her veins, overpowering the years of cultivated fear. It was a choice made in a split second, a gamble for her very soul. She ran. She ran with a desperation that few people will ever know. Her legs, weak from malnutrition and disuse, burned with the effort. Her lungs gasped for air. She wasn't just running from a man. She was running from a monster, from a subterranean hell, from a fate worse than death. She sprinted through the unfamiliar streets of Luoyang, a ghost returned to the world of the living. Her clothes were tattered, her appearance disheveled. Passers-by stared, confused and alarmed by the sight of the frantic, weeping woman, but no one intervened. She didn't stop, her eyes scanning wildly for one thing, one symbol of hope and safety, a police station. She found one, bursting through the doors in a state of absolute hysteria. The officers on duty were confronted with a scene of pure chaos. The woman was barely coherent, her words choked by sobs of terror and relief. She tried to explain her ordeal, but the story that tumbled out was so monstrous, so utterly beyond the realm of normal human experience, that it was met with initial disbelief. A man, a public official, had built a secret dungeon 4 meters beneath his basement. He had kidnapped multiple women, holding them as sex slaves. She told them she wasn't the only one. There were others, still trapped down there, in the dark. And then, she delivered the most chilling detail of all. Not everyone who had been taken into the dungeon was still alive. 2 had been murdered. The officers listened, their skepticism slowly eroding in the face of her genuine, profound trauma. The details she provided were too specific, her terror too real to be fabricated. This was not a delusion. This was a report of an active, ongoing nightmare. The atmosphere in the station shifted instantly from routine work to a state of high emergency. A special task force was immediately assembled. Patrol cars, investigators, and armed officers were dispatched to the address the woman provided, a seemingly ordinary apartment in a residential complex in the city's Zigong district. They were preparing to confront a monster, but they had no idea of the true, calculated evil they were about to unearth. To understand the horror that the escaped victim described, one must go back 3 years, to 2008, and one must look at the man who, to the outside world, was the very definition of unremarkable. His name was Lai Hao. At the time of his arrest, he was 34 years old. By all public accounts, he lived a life of quiet respectability. He held a stable, white-collar job as a technical supervision officer for the Loyang Municipal Quality and Technical Supervision Bureau. He was a civil servant, a cog in the vast machinery of the state. He was also a family man. He was married and had an 8-year-old son. However, in a detail that would later prove crucial to his secret life, his wife and child lived in a different location. They were completely separate from his daily activities in Loyang, and they were utterly oblivious to the darkness that was consumed. To his neighbors in the Zigong district community, Lai Hao was a quiet, introverted man. He was polite but distant, never socializing or drawing attention to himself. He was just another face in the crowd. At his workplace, he was considered a diligent and hardworking employee. He never caused any trouble, never showed any signs of aggression, and gave no indication whatsoever of the violent and depraved fantasies that churned within his mind. He had successfully constructed a perfect facade, a mask of utter normalcy that concealed the predator lurking just beneath the surface. He was a living embodiment of the classic double life. In 2008, this quiet civil servant took the first concrete step in manifesting his monstrous desires. He purchased a basement-level apartment in that ordinary residential building. The choice was deliberate and strategic. A basement unit would provide the necessary privacy and cover for the immense and audacious project he was about to undertake. He was going to build his own private prison. Shortly after acquiring the property, he began to dig. For nearly 2 years, from 2008 into 2009, Lai Hao labored in secret. This was not a sophisticated construction project with a crew and heavy machinery. It was the solitary, obsessive work of one man with simple, handheld tools. He worked mostly at night, when his neighbors were asleep. The muffled sounds of his shovel hitting the earth were absorbed by the ground around him. If anyone did happen to hear anything, he had a ready-made excuse. He was doing extensive renovations on his new apartment. The physical labor was immense. He would dig and scrape away at the earth, loosening soil and rock, and then painstakingly load it into bags. Then, under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, he would secretly transport the bags of dirt away from the property, disposing of them bit by bit, so as not to create a large, suspicious pile of excavated earth. It was a slow, methodical, and incredibly patient process. It demonstrated a level of planning, dedication, and foresight that was chilling. He was not an impulsive criminal. He was an architect of evil, meticulously building his kingdom of horror. By August of 2009, his work was complete. 4 meters beneath the floor of his unassuming basement apartment, a secret dungeon now existed. It was a space of approximately 20 square meters, a claustrophobic world of his own creation. He had engineered it for one purpose: to imprison human beings. It was not a simple pit in the ground. It was divided into a series of small, cramped corridors and cells. At least 2 of these cells were fitted with heavy, solid iron doors, turning them into inescapable cages. He had equipped his creation with the necessities for long-term confinement. He ran an electrical system down from the apartment above. He installed a computer with an internet connection. He had a backup generator in case of a power outage. A primitive ventilation system was put in place to circulate just enough air to keep his captives alive. And, most importantly, he had taken measures to soundproof the walls. He knew there would be. He wanted to ensure those screams would never reach the outside world. The dungeon was finished. It was operational. Now, all it needed was its first prisoner. In that same month, August 2009, Lai Hao went hunting. He targeted the city's nightlife and entertainment venues, specifically KTV, or karaoke bars. He knew that many of the young women working in these establishments came from difficult backgrounds, making them vulnerable. He believed their disappearance would be less likely to trigger a major police investigation compared to that of a college student or an office worker. He found his first victim. She was a 23-year-old woman working at a local KTV. Lahau approached her using his carefully constructed facade. He was not a monster. He was a potential client, a wealthy and powerful man. He used promises of money and a lavish lifestyle to lure her away from the relative safety of her workplace and back to his apartment. Once she was inside his home, the mask was dropped. The polite, wealthy client vanished, replaced by a violent predator. He quickly overpowered the woman, using force or possibly drugs to subdue her. Before she could fully comprehend what was happening, she was being dragged across the floor of the basement apartment. A section of the floor opened up, revealing a hidden entrance, a dark maw leading down into the earth. The woman was forced down into the darkness. The secret hatch closed above her, plunging her into a near-total blackness, the sound of the bolts sliding into place echoing the finality of her capture. The outside world, with its cars, its lights, and its people, had just disappeared. For this young woman, a nightmare that would span years had just begun. And on the surface, just a few meters above her head, her captor, Lahau, resumed his life as a quiet, unremarkable civil servant, his perfect secret held safely in the silent, soundproofed earth beneath his feet. The capture of the first victim in August 2009 was not an end for Lahau. It was a proof of concept. He had successfully built an impenetrable prison, abducted a human being, and erased her from the world, all without arousing the slightest suspicion. His grotesque experiment had worked. Now, emboldened by this success, he began to populate his subterranean kingdom. From late 2009 through the beginning of 2011, 5 more women disappeared on the vibrant nightlife of Loing. One by one, they were targeted, deceived, and ultimately consumed by the darkness beneath Lahau's. His method was consistent because it was effective. He presented himself as a safe, affluent figure, a man who could offer a better life, or at the very least, a profitable evening. He preyed on their trust and their vulnerability. Once they were lured back to his residence, the facade would crumble, and they would be met with overwhelming violence. They were then subdued and thrown into the dungeon, where the true horror would begin. The heavy iron doors would slam shut, and they would join the small, terrified community of the damned that Lahau was assembling. Down in that 20-square-meter space, a separate reality was forged. It was a world governed by absolute fear and dictated entirely by the whims of one man. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, waste, and despair. It was perpetually damp and dark, the only light coming from a few bare bulbs that Lahau controlled. He was their god, a cruel and capricious deity who held the power of life and death. He controlled the food, doling out just enough to keep them alive, often withholding it as a form of punishment. He controlled their bodies, subjecting them to regular and brutal sexual assault. And he controlled their minds through a relentless campaign of psychological torture. He was the sole arbiter of their existence, and he relentlessly beat down any glimmer of hope or defiance. As his collection of captives grew, Lahau's motivations began to evolve. While the core of his crimes was undoubtedly the fulfillment of his sadistic desires for power and sexual control, a new, more pragmatic purpose emerged. He saw a financial opportunity in the suffering he was inflicting. The man who had spent 2 years meticulously building a prison now decided to turn it into a grotesque business venture. He used the computer and the internet connection he had so thoughtfully installed and purchased a webcam. His prison was about to become a film set. He forced the captive women to perform in live pornographic shows, broadcasting their degradation to anonymous clients online, likely customers from overseas who paid for the grim spectacle. This act added a chilling new layer to his depravity. He was no longer just a kidnapper and a rapist. He was a producer of human misery for profit. The women were stripped of their last vestiges of humanity. They were not just his prisoners. They were now his assets, tools to be used and exploited to finance the very dungeon in which they were caged. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem. As the months bled into one another, the 6 women endured this living hell. But even in the most broken spirits, the will to survive can flicker. Sometime between late 2010 and early 2011, one of the victims refused to be subjugated any longer. We don't know her name. Her identity was never publicly released. But we know that she fought back. She resisted Lahau's commands. She defied his authority as she screamed. Her continued cries for help were a direct threat to his carefully constructed secret world. A neighbor, a passerby, a delivery person, anyone might hear a stray sound and bring his entire kingdom crashing down. For Lai Hao, this defiance could not be tolerated. She was not just a disobedient captive, she was a security risk. And so, he made a cold, calculated decision. She had to be silenced, permanently. But her death would serve a dual purpose. It would not only solve the problem of her resistance, but it would also serve as a terrifying message to the other 5 women. He needed to show them the ultimate consequence of disobedience. He went down into the dungeon and, with his own hands, he murdered her. The act was brutal and decisive. With her death, Lai Hao crossed a critical threshold. He was now a killer, but he did not bother to remove the body. Doing so would be risky and difficult. Instead, he turned the dungeon into a tomb. In a corner of the prison, he dug a shallow grave and buried her body. From that moment on, the 5 remaining women were forced to live, eat, and sleep in the same small space as their murdered friend. The grave was a constant, festering reminder of Lai Hao's absolute power. It was a monument to their own helplessness, a silent testament to the fate that awaited them if they ever dared to challenge their captor. The psychological impact of this act was devastating. Yet, for Lai Hao, it was not enough. As the seasons changed and summer of 2011 arrived, he decided to escalate his campaign of terror to an entirely new level of psychological warfare. Another one of the captives was deemed uncooperative. Perhaps she argued, or refused an order, or simply showed a spark of defiance in her eyes. This time, however, Lai Hao decided he would not be the executioner. He had a far more twisted and sinister plan in mind. He selected 2 of the other captives. Perhaps he chose them because they were the most broken, the most compliant, or the ones he believed he could control most effectively. He brought them before the defiant woman and gave them a horrific, unthinkable order. He commanded them to kill her for him. He stood and watched, a silent observer, as he forced his victims to become murderers. He allegedly provided them with a cord or a rope, and under his menacing supervision, the 2 terrified women were coerced into strangling the 3rd woman to death. This act was the pinnacle of his sadism. It was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation, designed to shatter the souls of the women he imprisoned. It was not simply about eliminating another problem. It was about destroying any possibility of unity or solidarity among them. How could they ever trust each other again when their own hands had been turned into weapons against one another? It was about shackling them with a profound and inescapable guilt. In their minds, they were no longer purely innocent victims. They were now killers themselves, tainted by the same crime as their captor. This guilt would serve as a powerful new chain, binding them to the dungeon and to him. He had made them accomplices, ensuring they would be too terrified of the legal consequences to ever seek help, even if the opportunity arose. He had transformed his prison from a place of shared suffering into a cauldron of mutual suspicion, fear, and self-loathing. Just like the first victim, the body of the second murdered woman was also buried within the confines of the dungeon. Now, 2 graves marked the floor of their cell, and for the 4 women who remained, hope was all but extinguished. They were trapped not only by iron doors and a secret entrance, but by the psychological poison of their own forced actions. Their will to escape, to fight, to even survive, was likely broken. And this is where Lai Hao's arrogance began to consume him. For 2 years, he had operated with perfect impunity. He had kidnapped 6 women. He had established a profitable online pornography ring. He had committed 2 murders, and the world outside remained completely oblivious. He had come to believe he was invincible, that his system was flawless, and that his captives were so thoroughly broken that he could do anything with them. And so, in early September of 2011, flush with this sense of absolute power, he made the single greatest miscalculation of his criminal career. Fueled by greed, he decided to break his own most important rule. He decided to take one of the women outside. The one he chose was the 24-year-old captive, the woman known to us only as M. He believed her spirit was crushed, her will non-existent. He was about to learn just how wrong he. The night of September 6, 2011, descended upon the residential community in the Zigong district, wrapping it in a deceptive tranquility. Inside their homes, families were eating dinner, watching television, completely unaware that a major police operation was unfolding just meters from their doorsteps. Guided by the raw, desperate testimony of the woman who had escaped, a heavily armed tactical team surrounded the basement apartment of Lai Hao. They moved with quiet efficiency, their mission clear: confront a potential monster and rescue anyone who might still be trapped in his lair. They breached the apartment and found Lai Hao inside. His reaction was not what they expected. There was no panicked attempt to flee, no violent resistance, no desperate denial. Instead, he was described as being unnervingly calm, his face a cold, emotionless mask. It was the placid demeanor of a man who knew the game was over and had already accepted his fate. The initial sweep of the apartment itself revealed nothing out of the ordinary. It was just a simple, sparsely furnished living space. For a tense moment, the officers might have wondered if the escaped woman's story was truly real. But her directions had been precise. A thorough search of the floor revealed the hidden seam, the concealed entrance to the world below, likely hidden beneath a rug or a piece of furniture. With a heavy creak, the officers pried open the hatch. The first thing that hit them was the smell, a wave of foul, stagnant air, a putrid combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, and decay. It was the smell of profound suffering. Peering down with flashlights, they saw not a cellar, but a crudely constructed prison. Investigators carefully made their way down the narrow passage into the dungeon itself. The scene that greeted them was one of unimaginable horror. The space was cramped, filthy, and oppressive. In the harsh glare of their flashlights, they saw the iron-barred cells, and inside, they found the remaining 4 captive. The women were in a catastrophic state. Physically, they were emaciated, their bodies bearing the marks of long-term malnutrition and abuse. But the psychological damage was even more apparent. They were terrified, cowering in the corners of their cells, shielding their eyes from the sudden, blinding light. Having known only one human presence for so long, that of their tormentor, they initially recoiled from their rescue. Their fear was so deeply ingrained that they could not immediately distinguish help from harm. It was a heartbreaking symptom of their prolonged trauma, a testament to the absolute control Lihao had exerted over them. Gently, patiently, the officers worked to coax the women out, speaking in calm voices, reassuring them that their ordeal was finally over. One by one, they were led out of the darkness that had been their world for years and brought back to the surface. As they emerged into the night air, they were not just being rescued from a dungeon. They were being reborn into a world they thought they would never see again. The dungeon was immediately sealed off and declared a major crime scene. As forensic teams began the meticulous process of combing through the filth, the full scale of Lihao's crimes began to reveal itself. They collected the physical evidence of his reign of terror. The chains, the handcuffs, the squalid bedding, and the computer he had used to broadcast his victims' suffering to the world. Acting on the horrifying testimony of the survivors, investigators began to excavate 2 specific locations on the dungeon floor. It was there, in shallow, unmarked graves, that they found the remains of the 2 women who had been murdered. Meanwhile, in an interrogation room, the man behind it all began to speak. The calm, emotionless facade Lihao had presented upon his arrest never cracked. He confessed to everything. With a chilling detachment, he recounted his crimes in methodical detail, as if he were filing a report on a completed project. He spoke of his addiction to violent pornography, and the obsessive desire that grew from it, the desire to create his own private kingdom, where he held absolute power, where he could control every aspect of another person's life. He admitted to the kidnappings, the rapes, and the murders. He coolly explained his logic for the second murder, confirming the survivors' most horrific account. He described how he forced 2 of the women to kill the third, stating that it was a test of their loyalty and a calculated strategy to shatter their will. By making them accomplices, he believed he had bound them to him forever, extinguishing their last hope of ever returning to a normal life. Throughout his confession, there was no sign of remorse, no flicker of empathy, no shred of regret. To Lihao, the women he tormented and killed were not human beings. They were objects, possessions to be used for his gratification. The investigation painted a clear portrait of a classic psychopath. Lihao was a master of the double life, capable of perfectly partitioning his existence as a mundane civil servant from his secret reality as a sadistic predator. His core motivation was not merely sexual. It was an all-consuming lust for absolute control. The dungeon was his throne room, and its captives were his subjects. He demonstrated a complete and total lack of empathy, viewing his victims as nothing more than. Yet, this depravity was paired with a sharp, methodical intelligence. The crime was not an impulsive act, but a long-term project executed with meticulous planning and patience. The legal process was swift. Lihao was charged with a host of crimes, including intentional homicide, kidnapping, rape, and organizing prostitution. On November 30, 2012, he faced trial. The proceedings were held behind closed doors to protect the identities and dignity of the surviving victims. Lihao confessed to all charges. The verdict was inevitable. He was sentenced to death and permanently stripped of all political rights. He did not appeal the sentence. In a remarkable display of judicial understanding, the court also passed sentence on the two women who had been forced to commit murder. Recognizing the unimaginable duress and coercion they had been under, the court showed mercy. One woman was sentenced to 3 years in prison, while the other received a suspended sentence. It was a legal acknowledgement that while they had committed a terrible act, they were victims first and foremost. After the mandatory review by China's Supreme People's Court, the sentence was upheld. On January 21, 2014, Lai Hao was executed. Justice, in its final, irreversible form, had been served. But the closing of the legal case did not end the story. For the survivors, the trauma is a life sentence. They carry wounds that will never fully heal: post-traumatic stress disorder, crippling anxiety, and a shattered sense of safety and trust. Their lives were irrevocably broken by one man's evil. Lai Hao's family, his wife and son, were also victims. Their lives were destroyed by the public shame and the horrifying revelation of the man they thought they knew. The case of the Luoyang sex dungeon sent a shockwave across China and the world, raising deeply unsettling questions. How could such a prolonged and horrific crime occur in the middle of a populated residential area, completely undetected? It serves as a chilling commentary on the anonymity and isolation of modern urban life, a world where neighbors can be strangers, and screams can be muffled by concrete and indifference. It forces us to confront the terrifying reality that the most inhuman monsters don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, they live right next door. They go to work, they pay their bills, and they smile politely. The greatest horror of Lai Hao is not that he was a monster, but that for years, he was so convincingly, so perfectly, one of us. Case 4. The first sensation was the cold. A damp, seeping chill that worked its way through her clothes and into her bones. Then came the darkness, a blackness so complete it felt heavy, pressing against her eyes. Consciousness returned not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent rush of confusion and pain. Her throat was a raw, burning agony, and a coppery taste filled her mouth. She tried to push herself up, but her hand sank into something soft, wet, and yielding. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in her mind. She tried again, on the other side, and her fingers brushed against what felt like fabric, stretched taut over something solid and unnervously still. The air was thick, foul with a smell so putrid it made her gag. It was the smell of a forgotten slaughterhouse, of rot and decay, a sweet, cloying odor that clung to the back of her throat. She didn't know where she was, or how she got there. The last thing she remembered was the face of her lover, his handsome features twisted into a mask of rage. She remembered his hands, strong and sure, closing around her neck, squeezing the air, the life from her body. He had whispered that he loved her, and then he had tried to kill her. He thought he had succeeded. Now, awakening in what she could only describe as a tomb, the horrifying truth began to dawn on her. She was not alone in the darkness. As her eyes struggled to adjust, she could make out shapes, pale and contorted, piled around her. They were bodies, dozens of them, in various states of decomposition. She was lying on a bed of the dead, the very victims she had helped lure to their doom. The man she loved, the leader she followed, had discarded her like all the others, tossing her into the mass grave he had dug in his own backyard. The terror of this realization was absolute. It was a hellish, subterranean world of his making. But the primal instinct to survive, the sheer refusal to die in this pit of horror, ignited a desperate strength within her. Clawing, slipping on the decaying flesh of those beneath her, fighting against the suffocating darkness and the stench of death, the woman began to climb. She had to get out, she had to live, and she had to make him pay. Her escape from that cellar would ultimately expose one of the most monstrous serial killing sprees in modern Chinese history. The investigation that followed would reveal a tale of manipulation, greed, and unimaginable cruelty, all orchestrated by one man whose charming exterior concealed the heart of a demon. The story of this man, the ringleader, begins in Na, a city in Heilongjiang province. Jia Wenj was born in 1965, of mixed Chinese and Russian descent, a heritage that gave him features considered handsome and striking. He was tall, with a charismatic air that he learned to weaponize from a young age. He knew how to talk to people, how to make them feel special, how to earn their trust with a disarming smile, a well-placed compliment. To the outside world, he was a presentable, articulate man, a factory worker who had graduated from junior high school. He was married, with a family, living in an unassuming single-story house with a small courtyard, the very picture of mundane, working-class life. But beneath this veneer of normality was a personality defined by a deep-seated narcissism and a profound laziness. He despised manual labor and craved a life of luxury and pleasure that his factory wages could never afford. He believed he was superior, that the normal rules of society did not apply to him. This grandiosity was coupled with a complete lack of empathy. Other people were not fellow human beings. They were merely instruments, objects to be used for his own gratification and then discarded. He was a man with a void where his conscience should have been. By 1989, this disdain for honest work led him to gather a small group of friends who shared his greedy and indolent worldview. They started small, committing petty thefts around the city, stealing whatever they could to fund their days of drinking and leisure. But the meager returns from these minor crimes were not enough to satisfy the ringleader's growing appetite for more. He wanted more money, more control, more excitement. And he soon realized that the ultimate crime, murder, offered the quickest path to getting everything he desired. On July 12, 1990, the gang crossed a line from which there was no return. That evening, the ringleader was prowling the streets of Nea, his eyes scanning for a target. He spotted a prostitute carrying what appeared to be an expensive handbag. She was his first choice. Approaching her, he turned on his well-practiced charm. With his good looks and smooth words, he had no trouble convincing her to accompany him back to his home. She likely believed she had found a wealthy and generous client for the night. She had no idea she was walking into a predator's lair. Inside the house, the facade dropped. He didn't just want her money. He wanted the thrill of absolute power. He attacked her, his hands wrapping around her throat in a practiced grip. He squeezed, watching the life fade from her eyes. After she was dead, he took her handbag and any other valuables she had on her person. The act was shockingly easy for him. There was no remorse, no hesitation. He had taken a human life. All he felt was the satisfaction of a problem solved. He now had a new, brutally efficient method for acquiring wealth. This first murder opened the floodgates. The 13 months that followed, from the summer of 1990 to August of 1991, would become a period of relentless, horrifying slaughter. The gang, under the absolute command of their leader, transformed into a well-oiled killing machine. They began to target a wide array of individuals. Their victims included other prostitutes, migrant workers who had come to Nea seeking employment, traveling business people known to carry cash, and even young couples who seemed to have valuable possessions. Anyone who appeared vulnerable and had something of value was a potential target. The gang's cruelty was matched only by their greed. The ringleader understood that his charm was his greatest asset, but he also knew that the presence of a woman would make potential victims lower their guard even further. He seduced a married woman, known as He, who was unhappy in her own life and easily fell under his charismatic spell. She became his lover and his most crucial accomplice. Together, they would pose as a couple or as business partners, their respectable appearance disarming even the most cautious individual. Their method was brutally simple and effective. They would invite a target back to the ringleader's house, often under the pretense of a friendly drink or a business deal. Once inside, they would ply the victim with alcohol, sometimes laced with sedatives, or simply overwhelm them with brute. After the victims were subdued and robbed of everything they owned, they were murdered. The ringleader showed no preference in his method of killing. Strangulation was common, but any means to silence them permanently was employed. He operated on a simple, chilling principle: dead witnesses tell no tales. To leave anyone alive was an unnecessary risk, a loose end he was unwilling to tolerate. With each murder came the problem of disposing of the body, and for this, the ringleader devised a solution as audacious as it was grotesque. In the small courtyard of his own home, the same home where he lived with his wife and children, he dug a pit. This was no simple hole. It was a designated tomb, a cellar whose sole purpose was to serve as a mass grave. After each murder, the victim's body was unceremoniously dragged out to the yard and thrown into the pit. One after another, the bodies began to pile up. The man who committed these atrocities would then go back inside, eat dinner with his family, and sleep in his bed, just meters away from the 42 bodies that would eventually fill that subterranean hell. The psychological fortitude required to live this double life, to carry on with such normalcy while sitting atop a tomb of his own making, speaks to a level of psychopathy that is almost impossible to comprehend. For over a year, as the number of missing person reports in Nea steadily climbed and police grew increasingly desperate for a lead, the source of the disappearances was hiding in plain sight, smiling at his neighbors, living a quiet life built on a foundation of corpses. While the ringleader and his crew operated with a chilling efficiency, the police force of Nea City found themselves fighting a war in the shadows, battling an enemy they couldn't see and a crime they couldn't prove was even happening. Around 1990 and 1991, the station desks were filled with an ever-growing pile of missing persons files. At first, they seemed unrelated. A traveling salesman who never made it to his next destination. A young woman who worked the city's nightlife and suddenly vanished. A migrant worker whose family back home stopped receiving letters and money. Each case was a separate tragedy, a private mystery for the family left behind. Investigators followed the standard procedures. They interviewed friends and relatives, visited last known locations, and checked travel records. But every lead evaporated into thin air. The problem was the nature of the victims themselves. Many were transients, with shallow roots in the city, making it difficult to establish a clear timeline of their finals. They were people who could disappear without immediately raising a citywide alarm. More importantly, there was a complete absence of physical evidence. No bodies were ever found by the roadside. No abandoned cars filled with blood. No witnesses reported hearing screams or seeing a struggle. The victims were simply erased from existence. Without a body, a crime scene, or a weapon, the police were hamstrung. They were dealing with dozens of individual puzzles that they couldn't piece together because the most crucial piece, the victim, was always missing. The pressure from the public and from provincial authorities mounted with each new report. Rumors began to circulate through the city, whispers of a phantom menace that spirited people away. But with no tangible clues, the police were chasing ghosts. They had no way of knowing that all their missing persons were connected, that all the answers they sought were buried together in a single, ghastly pit in an ordinary-looking courtyard. The gang's method was, for a terrifyingly long time, the perfect crime. Inside the gang, however, the architect of this perfect crime was governed by his own twisted logic. The ringleader, Jia Wenj, ruled his accomplices through a combination of shared greed and absolute fear. He was the undisputed leader, the mastermind who planned every move. He distributed the spoils of their crimes, but he did so in a way that always reinforced their dependence on him. That his paranoia and malignant narcissism meant that no one was ever truly safe. He trusted no one because he knew that loyalty, like love or empathy, was just another tool for manipulation. And the person closest to him, his lover and primary female accomplice, was about to become his biggest perceived liability. The case files do not specify the exact reason, but sometime in the middle of 1991, the ringleader decided that the woman who had helped him lure so many to their deaths had to die herself. Perhaps it was a dispute over the division of their stolen wealth. Perhaps he saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes and feared she might one day betray him to the authorities. Or perhaps, in his pathologically inflated self-image, he simply grew tired of. Having served her purpose, she was now just a loose end. To a psychopath, a person's value is purely functional. Once that function ceases, their existence is a liability. The attack was as personal as it was brutal. He didn't assign the task to one of his other henchmen. He did it himself. In a moment of shocking betrayal, he turned on her. The woman who had followed him into a life of crime, who had been his partner in murder, looked into his eyes and saw not a lover, but a cold-blooded executioner. He wrapped his hands around her neck, the same hands he had likely used to caress her, and he squeezed. He was an expert at this. He knew the pressure to apply, the time it would take. He held on until her body went limp, until she was completely still. Convinced that she was dead, he showed no more emotion than if he were disposing of a piece of trash. He dragged her body out into the courtyard, lifted the cover of the cellar, and threw her in. He was adding her to his collection, the final, definitive act of control over someone he had once pretended to care for. It was his greatest mistake. In his supreme arrogance, he never bothered to confirm the kill. He simply assumed his work was done. So certain was he of his own infallibility, the thought that she might have survived, that she might have only lost consciousness due to asphyxiation, never crossed his mind. With his accomplice, in his mind, now permanently silenced among the rotting corpses of their victims, the gang's activities continued without missing a beat. In fact, they are known to have committed at least one more murder after he had thrown her into the pit. The killing had become so routine, so detached from any emotional reality, that even the murder of one of their own was just a minor interruption in their business. However, the ringleader was not entirely without a sense of self-preservation. By August of 1991, he began to feel that the situation in Nea was becoming too hot. The sheer number of disappearances was drawing unwanted attention, and the risk of a random connection being made, however small, was increasing. It was time for a change of scenery. The gang packed up their operations and fled south, heading to the sprawling provinces of southern China, where they believed they could disappear into the crowds and establish a new hunting ground. They left behind the house and the horrific secret buried in its yard, confident it would never be found. They had not counted on a miracle. They had not counted on the incredible resilience of the woman they left for dead. Or perhaps even days after being thrown into the cellar, she awoke to a living nightmare. And when she clawed her way out of that pit of death, she did not run and hide. Fueled by terror and a burning desire for revenge against the man who betrayed her, she ran in the only direction she could, straight to the police. Imagine the scene at the local precinct. A woman, covered in filth and the putrescence of the grave, bursts through the doors. She is hysterical, barely coherent, but through her sobs, she begins to tell a story. It is a story so monstrous, so beyond the pale of normal human experience, that the officers on duty at first struggle to believe it. She confesses everything. She gives them the name of the ringleader, Ji Wenj. She names the 4 other male accomplices. She details their methods, the seductions, the robberies, the murders. And then, she delivers the piece of information that changes everything. She tells them where to find the bodies. She tells them about the cellar. She tells them to go to the house of Ji Wenj, to dig in his yard, and there they would find the proof for every unsolved disappearance that had haunted the city for the last 13 months. For the frustrated investigators of Ne, her testimony was like a lightning strike in the dark. It was the key that unlocked everything. The scattered, unrelated cases on their desks suddenly snapped into focus, revealing a single, horrifying picture. Acting with incredible speed, the Ne Public Security Bureau issued an immediate, high-priority arrest warrant for Ji Wenj and his entire gang. Based on the survivors' information that they had fled south, a massive, interprovincial manhunt was launched. The ghost they had been chasing for over a year finally had a name and a face. Now, they just had to catch him. At the same time, a team of investigators and forensic specialists was dispatched to the ringleader's unassuming house, armed with shovels and a search warrant, about to unearth a scene of unimaginable horror that would shock the entire nation. As the nationwide manhunt for the gang intensified, a specialized team of police and forensic investigators arrived at the quiet, unassuming house of Ji Wenj in Ne. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from any other home on the street. It was a place where a family lived, where meals were cooked, where children likely played. This veneer of absolute normality made the task ahead of them all the more grotesque. The surviving accomplice had given them the location, but nothing could have truly prepared them for what they were about to uncover. Guided by her directions, they focused on the small courtyard. When they lifted the makeshift cover from the cellar, they were hit by a physical wave of stench so powerful it caused even the most hardened veterans to recoil. It was the concentrated smell of mass death, sealed in the earth. The excavation that followed was a slow, grim, and psychologically punishing ordeal. In the dim light, working in the cramped space, investigators began to remove the victims, one by one. The scene was a horrifying tableau of tangled limbs and decomposed remains. Each body they recovered was a testament to the gang's relentless brutality and a piece of a puzzle that had perplexed them for over a year. They dug first, and the count kept rising. 10 bodies became 20, then 30. The sheer scale of the killing was staggering. By the time they reached the bottom of the pit, they had recovered a total of 42 victims. The survivors' incredible story was corroborated in the most horrific way imaginable. The courtyard of this ordinary family home had been concealing a secret mass grave, one of the largest ever discovered in a serial murder case. The psychological toll on the officers who witnessed the scene was immense. It was an image of pure, unadulterated evil that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. While the horror in Ne was being unearthed, the net was closing around the fugitives in the south. The country's law enforcement apparatus, now fully mobilized, tracked the gang's movements with precision. The members soon realized there was no place left to run. Faced with imminent capture, one of the 4 male accomplices made a final, desperate choice. Cornered by police, he ingested poison, committing suicide rather than facing justice for his crime. He chose a quick exit, a stark contrast to the slow, agonizing deaths he had helped inflict on their victim. Shortly thereafter, the ringleader himself, Ji Wenj, and the remaining 3 accomplices were captured. There was no dramatic final standoff. The man who saw himself as a criminal mastermind, who believed he was untouchable, was brought down not by a brilliant detective, but by the resilience of a woman he had failed to kill and the dogged, systematic work of the police. His reign of terror was officially over. The trial of Jie Wenj and his surviving accomplices began on January 8, 1992, at the Kikihar Intermediate People's Court. The case had become a national sensation, and the courtroom was filled with the grieving families of the victims, members of the press, and a public desperate to see justice done. The prosecution laid out the entirety of the gang's crimes, detailing the 42 murders, the numerous robberies, and the elaborate, cold-blooded methods they employed. The evidence, anchored by the testimony of the lone survivor and the undeniable proof from the cellar, was overwhelming. Throughout the proceedings, all eyes were on the ringleader. Jie Wenj sat in the dock with an unnerving calm. He displayed no emotion. There was no remorse, no flicker of regret, not even a sign of fear. As the horrific details of his actions were read aloud, he remained impassive, his face a cold, blank mask. This chilling lack of humanity in the face of his accusers was perhaps the final, most profound confirmation of his monstrous nature. It was an insult to the families of those he had murdered, and it sealed his fate. The verdict was swift and decisive. For his role as the mastermind and his direct participation in the murder of 42 people, Jie Wenj was found guilty and sentenced to death. The other captured members of his gang also received the harshest possible sentences, including the death penalty and life imprisonment, based on their individual levels of culpability. The female accomplice who survived and went to the police faced a more complex judgment. She was, without question, a participant in numerous heinous crimes. However, the court recognized that without her confession, the case might never have been solved. Her testimony was deemed an act of meritorious service, a critical contribution that atoned for a portion of her guilt. She was spared the death penalty, receiving a more lenient sentence that was not publicly disclosed. Justice, in this case, was not delayed. On January 24, 1992, just 16 days after the trial concluded, Jie Wenj and his condemned accomplices were escorted to an execution ground and put to death by firing squad. The case was officially closed, but its impact continued to ripple outwards. For the city of Nha, it left a deep psychological scar. The discovery that such a prolific monster had lived quietly among them shattered the community's sense of security. Trust between neighbors was eroded, and a new, sharp-edged fear of the handsome stranger, the friendly face, took hold. Nationally, the Jie Wenj case became a landmark in the annals of Chinese crime. It dominated news headlines, forcing a nationwide conversation about public safety and the dark side of a society undergoing rapid economic and social change. For law enforcement, it became a crucial case study in investigating serial disappearances and the importance of connecting seemingly unrelated cases. In the end, we are left to contemplate the man at the center of this storm of violence. Criminal psychologists would classify Jie Wenj as a malignant narcissist and a classic psychopath. He possessed all the key traits: the superficial charm, the manipulative tendencies, the grandiose sense of self-worth, and the complete, chilling inability to feel empathy or remorse. He saw other people as objects, and murder as a simple tool for acquisition and risk management. The most haunting detail remains his ability to live a normal life directly on top of his hidden graveyard. This demonstrates a capacity for psychological compartmentalization so profound it defies understanding. He was not a man haunted by his deeds. He was empowered by them. The story of the Nha serial killings is a brutal catalog of human evil, but it is also a story with one of the most incredible plot twists in the history of true crime. The ringleader's downfall came from a single, arrogant mistake: the failure to ensure his last victim was truly dead. The survival and testimony of his former accomplice was the one variable his cold, calculating mind could never have anticipated. It was an act of poetic justice, a ghost rising from a grave to point an accusing finger at her own murderer. And yet, questions still linger. The full identities of all 42 victims were never released to the public, leaving many of them as nameless shadows in this horrific story. It is unknown if Jie Wenj and his gang committed other crimes before their recorded spree began in 1990. But perhaps the most chilling question is the one that can never be truly answered: why the cellar? Why commit these acts and conceal them in the one place that was so intimately connected to him? Was it a display of ultimate contempt for law enforcement? Or was it the act of a supreme narcissist, a man who derived a godlike thrill from keeping his trophies, his secrets, buried just a few feet beneath his own sleeping family? We will never know. We can only look at the facts and see the portrait of a modern monster, whose handsome face and charming smile masked the void of infinite darkness. Case 5. On the 19th of July, 2021, the Brisbane air was mild, typical for a winter day in Queensland, Australia. in the upscale riverside suburb of Hamilton, life moved at its usual, relaxed pace. But inside a modern apartment complex, that sense of normalcy was about to be shattered. Officers from the Queensland Police Service stood outside the door of a unit, not for a raid, but for a welfare check. The request had come from Sydney, originating from a friend who had grown increasingly worried about a young woman named Qiangyan. The friend hadn't spoken to her directly in months, only receiving a series of strange text messages that felt wrong. The initial report was filed 3 months earlier, on April 12th, but the investigation had finally led officers to this specific address. They entered the apartment. At first glance, everything appeared to be in order. The space was tidy, lived in, showing no immediate signs of a struggle or disturbance. It looked like the home of any other young person living and studying far from their home country. The officers moved through the rooms, their eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary, for any clue that could explain where the 29-year-old Chinese national might be. The kitchen was clean. The living room was neat. But as they approached the sliding glass door leading to the balcony, their attention was drawn to an object that seemed utterly out of place. Sitting on the balcony was a large, metal toolbox. It was industrial in size, the kind one might find on a construction site or in a mechanic's workshop, not on the balcony of a residential apartment. It was a jarring sight against the backdrop of potted plants and outdoor furniture. An immediate sense of unease set over the investigator. One of the officers approached the box. As he got closer, a faint, foul odor became noticeable, a smell that a trained officer knows all too well. It was the smell of decomposition. With a growing sense of dread, they pried the lid open. The sight inside was horrifying. Curled within the confines of the metal box were the badly decomposed remains of a human body. The welfare check for a missing person had just become the scene of a homicide. Due to the severe state of decay, identifying the victim was impossible at the scene. The investigators could only confirm that the remains were female. The entire apartment was immediately sealed off, and the homicide investigation unit was called in. As forensic teams began their meticulous work, the central question was no longer, where is Qiangyan? But is this Qiangyan? And if so, who was responsible? The answer to the second question seemed to point to one individual, the person who shared this apartment with the victim. Her roommate, a 26-year-old man named Yang Zhao. While the discovery was made in July of 2021, the story of what happened in that apartment began nearly a year earlier, in September of 2020. Qiangyan was a young woman from China, building a life for herself in Australia. She lived with Yang Zhao, also a Chinese national. On the surface, they were just two students sharing a living space to cut down on costs. But beneath this ordinary arrangement, Zhao was living a life of financial desperation. His student visa had already expired back in April 2020, making his status in the country illegal. More pressingly, he had a gambling problem, one that had plunged him into significant debt. Prosecutors would later argue that he was losing a great deal of money and was looking for a way out. He found that way in the person he shared his home with. Sometime in that month of September, an argument broke out between the two roommates. The precise details of the disagreement remained known only to the perpetrator, but its conclusion was violent and final. Fueled by what prosecutors would later describe as pure financial greed, Yang Zhao attacked his roommate. He delivered one or more powerful blows to her head, incapacitating her. Then, he wrapped his hands around her neck and strangled the life out of her. In a matter of moments, Qiangyan was dead, and Yang Zhao was a murderer. His next actions were not those of panic, but of cold, calculated concealment. Faced with the body of his victim, he acquired the large metal toolbox. He forced her body inside, sealing it shut. Then, he moved the heavy container out onto the balcony of their shared apartment. He would later, in a chillingly detached confession to police, refer to this container simply as the body box. With the physical evidence of his crime hidden just a few feet from his living space, Zhao began the second phase of his plan, stealing the victim's identity and her money. He took Qiangyan's mobile phone, which was now his key to her entire world. He had access to her banking apps, her social media accounts, her contacts. He immediately began transferring money from her accounts to his own. The initial sum was staggering, approximately 200,000 Australian dollars. This money was a lifeline, a way to pay off his pressing gambling debts and fund his lifestyle. To ensure no suspicions were raised about the victim's disappearance, he continued to pay her half of the rent for the apartment. It was a crucial step to maintain the illusion that she was still alive and living there, and it also ensured that he would not be evicted, allowing him to keep the body box, and its contents close and under his control. But the $200,000 was not enough. Ja's greed, or perhaps his desperation, drove him to a new level of depravity. He began to use the victim's phone to contact her mother, Wai Wang, who was back in China. Posing as her daughter, he would send text messages, crafting a believable digital phantom. He told the victim's mother that he, as Qiang Yan, was busy with her studies and life in Australia. He made excuses for why she couldn't take phone calls or video chat. He would claim the connection was poor, that she was in the library, or that the time difference was inconvenient. Then, he started asking for money. He invented a variety of reasons, weaving a web of lies to manipulate a mother who believed she was helping her child. Over the next 10 months, Wai Wang, believing her daughter was safe and sound, transferred huge sums of money into what she thought was her daughter's bank account. In reality, she was sending her life savings directly to the man who had murdered her only child. The total amount he managed to deceive her out of was over 400,000 Australian dollars. In total, between the victim's own savings and the money from her mother, Nong Zhao had stolen around $600,000. For 10 months, he lived this monstrous double life. He would wake up in the apartment, walk past the balcony where his victim's body was decomposing, and then use her phone to send a cheerful good morning message to her mother before asking for another wire transfer. He was both a murderer and a master manipulator, carrying on a conversation with a grieving family as if nothing had happened. But even the most carefully constructed lie can develop cracks. Early 2021, a friend of the victim living in Sydney began to notice them. This friend had known Qiang Yan for a long time. They communicated regularly, but now, the text messages she was receiving from the victim's number felt different. The language was off, the phrasing wasn't right. The warm, familiar personality of her friend had been replaced by a colder, more distant tone. Every attempt to have a real conversation over the phone was rebuffed with The friend's initial confusion slowly turned into suspicion, and suspicion festered into a deep, gnawing anxiety. Something was terribly wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that the person on the other end of those text messages was not her friend. This persistent doubt would eventually become the catalyst that would expose the entire horrific. It was this friend's courage to trust her instincts and contact the authorities that set in motion the chain of events leading police to that apartment in Hamilton, and to the grim discovery on the balcony. The official missing person report, filed on April 12, 2021, marked the beginning of the end for Yang Jia's elaborate deception. For months, the friend in Sydney had been wrestling with a growing sense of dread. The text messages from Qiang Yan's phone were becoming more and more uncharacteristic. They were short, dismissive, and lacked the warmth and detail that had defined her friend's personality. Every request for a phone call was met with a new excuse. The friend's intuition screamed that something was wrong, and she finally acted on it, contacting the authorities. This single act of concern transformed a hidden, private horror into an official police investigation. Initially, the investigation proceeded with the caution typical of adult missing person cases. The police had to consider that an adult has the right to privacy, to drop contact with friends or family if they so choose. From a distance, some of the data points might not have seemed immediately alarming. Rent for the apartment was still being paid on time, and the victim's phone was still active, sending and receiving messages. To an outside observer, these could be considered proof of life. But the persistence of the friend in Sydney, her insistence that the digital activity did not match the person she knew, kept the case from being dismissed or placed on the back burner. Investigators began digging deeper into the digital and financial records associated with Qiang Yan. The first major red flag was the financial data. They uncovered the massive fund transfers. First, the $200,000 moved from the victim's account directly into Yang Jia. This was not a loan or a friendly transaction. It was the systematic draining of a person's life savings. Then they saw the second stream of income, more than $400,000 arriving in large wire transfers from the victim's mother in China. And almost as quickly as the money arrived in the victim's account, it was moved again, siphoned off by Jia. The money trail was a blazing arrow pointing directly at the roommate. He was the sole beneficiary for This financial motive, combined with the suspicious nature of the text messages, gave the police what they needed: probable cause. They could now argue before a judge that this was not simply a case of a person who had voluntarily gone silent. There was evidence of significant financial fraud and a strong possibility of foul play. The 3-month period between the friend's report in April and the search in July was spent meticulously building this case. ensuring that when they did act, it would be on solid legal ground. On July 19th, the day the search warrant was executed, the investigation accelerated from a slow burn to an inferno. With the discovery of the body, all pretense vanished. Nong Jia went from being a person of interest to the prime and only suspect. He was located, arrested, and taken into custody for questioning. The interrogations took place on July 19th and July 22nd. Away from the apartment, inside the stark, sterile environment of a police interview room, Jia's carefully constructed world crumbled. Faced with the undeniable reality that the body had been found, he confessed. He admitted to the detectives that he had killed his. He recounted the basic facts of the crime, that he had assaulted her and then hidden her body inside the toolbox. It was during these interviews that he used the cold, detached term, body box, to describe the victim's makeshift coffin, a phrase that gave investigators a chilling insight into his psychological state. His confession was a critical breakthrough, providing a direct admission of guilt from the perpetrator himself. He had placed himself at the scene, acknowledged his actions, and confirmed that he was responsible for the victim's death and the concealment of her remains. While Zhao was confessing, the forensic side of the investigation was working to piece together the physical evidence. The autopsy was an incredibly challenging task. After nearly a year inside a sealed metal container, exposed to the temperature fluctuations of the Brisbane climate, the victim's body was severely decomposed. This made determining the exact cause of death difficult. However, the medical examiner was able to find conclusive evidence of injury. The examination revealed trauma to the victim's head, consistent with one or more significant blows. Furthermore, there was evidence of asphyxiation, consistent with strangulation. This forensic finding was a cornerstone of the case. It proved that Qiang Yan's death was not peaceful, accidental, or self-inflicted. It was violent. It was a homicide. And critically, this physical evidence would later serve to dismantle the alternate reality the suspect would try to present in court. With the confession and the autopsy results, the pieces of the puzzle locked firmly into place. The prosecution now had a comprehensive and compelling case against Yang Jia. They had a clear motive: financial desperation driven by gambling addiction, which led to the theft of $600,000. They had the means and opportunity. As her roommate, he had the access and ability to commit the crime undetected. They had his post-offense conduct, a sophisticated, year-long campaign of deception and fraud to cover his tracks and continue to profit from his crime. They had his own words, a direct confession to the murder and concealment. And they had the physical evidence from the victim's body that corroborated a violent death. Based on the overwhelming weight of this evidence, Nong Jia was formally charged with 1 count of murder and 1 count of misconduct with a corpse. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, but they would turn slowly. A long period followed the arrest, a span of nearly 4 years between his charge in July 2021 and his trial in May 2025. During this time, the prosecution painstakingly prepared every document, every financial record, every witness statement for presentation to a jury. The defense team, meanwhile, was preparing their own strategy. And it was during this long wait that Yang Zhao, knowing the strength of the evidence against him, decided he would not go to trial with the story he told the police. He would invent a new one. He would plead guilty to the lesser charge of interfering with a corpse, but he would plead not guilty to murder, setting the stage for a dramatic courtroom battle where he would attempt one final, audacious act of deception. In May of 2025, 4 years after the grim discovery on the balcony, Nong Zhao, now 30 years old, stood before the Brisbane Supreme Court. Years of legal preparation had come to this moment. The evidence was compiled, the witnesses were ready, and the story of Qiang Yan's final days was about to be laid bare for a jury of 12 citizens to judge. The trial began with a formality that would define the entire legal battle. Nong Zhao was asked how he pleaded to the charges. To the charge of misconduct with a corpse, his lawyer responded, guilt. It was an admission of the undeniable. He had hidden the body. He had desecrated the remains of his victim. But to the most serious charge, the charge of murder, he uttered the words, not guilt. With that plea, the defense team unveiled their strategy. It was an audacious and unexpected narrative, a complete reversal of his initial confession to police. His lawyers argued that what happened in that apartment in September 2020 was not a murder, but a tragic accident. They painted a picture of Qiang Yan as someone who had been voluntarily experimenting with nitrous oxide, commonly known as laughing gas. Their story was that she had been inhaling the gas, had a fatal reaction, and simply died. In this version of events, Yang Zhao was not a killer. He was just a witness, a roommate who came across a terrible scene. The defense argued that his subsequent actions, while wrong, were born of pure panic. As an illegal immigrant with an expired visa, he was terrified of contacting the authorities. He believed that reporting the death would lead to his immediate deportation, and that no one would believe his story. So, in a moment of profound fear and poor judgment, he made the decision to hide the body. The elaborate financial fraud, they suggested, was an act of opportunism that followed, not a motive that preceded the death. It was a desperate attempt to portray him as a panicked young man who made one bad decision after another, rather than a cold-blooded, calculating killer. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Chris Cook, stood to address this narrative. He began to systematically dismantle it, piece by piece, with the cold, hard facts of the investigation. The centerpiece of his rebuttal was the autopsy. Prosecutor Cook presented the jury with the medical examiner's findings: blunt force trauma to the head and asphyxiation due to strangulation. He stressed that the forensic evidence showed a violent, brutal end to the victim's life. There was no evidence to support the theory of a nitrous oxide accident. The defense's story was a fantasy, a fabrication cooked up during the years Jha sat in prison, a desperate lie designed to evade responsibility for his action. Next, the prosecutor turned to the undeniable motive: money. He walked the jury through the complex financial records, showing them the methodical draining of the victim's bank accounts. He showed them the records of the more than $400,000 transferred by the victim's trusting mother, money that went straight into Jha's pockets. He described Jha's gambling habits, painting a clear picture of a man desperate for cash. In a powerful address to the jury, Prosecutor Cook stated that Jha's motive was the oldest and simplest in the book: greed. Murder for money, he argued, can be a profitable crime if you get away with it. To counter the defense's claim of panic, the prosecution highlighted the sheer length and complexity of the cover-up. These were not the actions of a man in a blind panic. A panicked person might hide a body for a day or a week. They would not meticulously impersonate their victim for 10 months, managing their social communications and systematically defrauding their family. They would not have the cold detachment to continue paying rent on a crime scene to avoid detection. The prosecutor argued that this prolonged deception was evidence of a clear, criminal mind at work, a mind that was not panicked, but was callously and patiently executing a plan to profit from a murder. Finally, the prosecution used Jha's own words against him. They presented the details of his initial police interviews from July 2021, where he had plainly admitted to killing Qiangyan, and they emphasized his chillingly casual reference to the murder weapon's container as the body box. This was not the language of an innocent bystander. It was the language of a killer. The jury listened to both sides. They heard the defense's tale of a tragic accident, a panicked cover-up. They heard the prosecution's evidence of a violent death, a clear financial motive, and a calculated, long-term deception. Their task was to decide which version of events was the truth. They did not need long. After deliberating for less than a full day, the jury returned. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict. On the charge of murder, they found Yang Zhao guilty. On May 26, 2025, Yang Zhao appeared for his sentence. Justice Peter Culligan, presiding over the case, addressed the convicted murderer. The judge spoke of the brutal nature of the crime and the almost unimaginable cruelty of the deception that followed. He condemned Jha's actions, particularly how he had manipulated the victim's mother, giving her false hope while simultaneously stealing her life savings. For the crime of murder, the sentence in Queensland was mandatory. Justice Culligan sentenced Yang Zhao to life in prison. He then set the non-parole period, ruling that Jha must serve a minimum of 22 years before he could even become eligible to apply for release. The verdict brought the legal chapter to a close, but for the victim's family, the pain was permanent. Her mother, Wai Wang, had endured a unique and profound. She not only had to grapple with the violent death of her only child, but also the gut-wrenching realization that for 10 months, every message of love and every dollar she sent to support her daughter was being received by her killer. The decomposition of the body was so advanced that she was denied even the final closure of seeing her daughter's face one last time. The family had to perform the heartbreaking task of identifying her remains through the unique jewelry she wore, inanimate objects that became the final testament to a life cut short. The case sent a tremor of fear through the community of international students in Brisbane, a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities that can exist when living far from home. It was a story that defied belief that a roommate could commit such a horrific act and live with the evidence. just outside on a balcony, for so long, and still, some questions linger. The most baffling of all is a practical one. How did he manage to conceal a decomposing body on an apartment balcony for 10 months without neighbors, building management, or visitors ever detecting the odor? The specific details of how he sealed the box and masked the evidence remain a chilling testament to his meticulous planning. In the end, the case of Kyung Yun is a story of a life stolen by greed. It is a story of a calculated, cold-blooded crime, followed by a campaign of emotional and financial abuse that was as cruel as the murder itself. It is a story that was only brought to light by the persistent intuition of a friend who knew something was wrong, and a police investigation that pieced together digital ghosts and financial footprints to uncover a terrible truth hidden in plain sight. Case 6. In late 2012, in the quiet, rural landscape of Fakeson County, Shandong Province, a young man named Huo Jianguo was building a life filled with modest dreams and profound happiness. Born in 1987, Jianguo was a skilled professional chef, a craft he had honed since he was a young man. He was known for his discipline and healthy lifestyle. He didn't smoke, drink alcohol, or even eat meat. He was a man of simple principles and dedicated work ethic. His heart, however, was set on two things: his new wife, Zhang Qingling, and the family they were about to start. They had married just 7 months prior, a joyful occasion that marked the beginning of their shared future. Tingling was a young woman, deeply loved not only by her husband but also by his mother, with whom she shared a warm and close relationship. Soon after their wedding, the couple moved into a small house on the outskirts of Dangjiashuan village. The location was somewhat isolated, set apart from the tight-knit clusters of homes that made up the village center, offering them privacy and a space to call their own. For Jianguo, this house was the foundation upon which he would build his family's future. He was an entrepreneur at heart. Together with Qingling, he poured his savings and his culinary skills into a small, street-side barbecue stand located in the village market. It was a humble business, but it was theirs. Day after day, Jianguo worked the grill while Qingling managed the customers and the finances. They were a team, working towards a common goal. Their life was a simple rhythm of hard work, shared meals, and quiet evenings spent together, planning for the days ahead. In February of 2013, their world became brighter. They received the news they had been hoping for. Tingling was pregnant. The joy that filled their small home was immeasurable. Jianguo was ecstatic. The prospect of becoming a father gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Every decision, every hour of work, was now dedicated to the child who was on the way. He was, by all accounts, a loving husband, and everyone who knew him could see he was destined to be a devoted father. However, their life was not without its small struggles. Shortly after opening their barbecue stand, they were forced to shut it down. They had run into a bureaucratic hurdle, missing local business permit that the authorities insisted they obtain. It was a frustrating setback, a temporary halt to their dream, but it didn't break their spirits. They were resourceful and determined, confident that they could resolve the issue and reopen their stand soon. Life in their isolated home had also presented a challenge earlier that year. The couple's house was burglarized. The incident was unsettling, a violation of their personal sanctuary. In response, they decided to invest in a security measure that was quite uncommon, almost a luxury, in their rural community at the time. They installed a home security camera system. It was a practical decision, born from a desire to protect their home and their growing family. They believed it would deter any future intruders, giving them peace of mind. They had no way of knowing that this very symbol of security would, in a cruel twist of fate, be misinterpreted as a sign of wealth, ultimately painting a target on their backs. May 14, 2013, was a day like any other, filled with the mundane tasks of life. Jianguo and Qingling spent the day at a local government office, diligently working to secure the permit needed to restart their business. They were last seen by officials there, two young people navigating paperwork, focused on getting their dream back on track. As evening fell, they made their way home, likely tired but hopeful, perhaps discussing their plans for the baby and the future of their barbecue stand. They traveled the familiar road to their quiet house on the edge of the village, completely unaware that their home was no longer a sanctuary. It had been invaded. Inside, a group of 4 young men were waiting. They had broken in while the house was empty, and with a chilling sense of entitlement, they had made themselves at home. They ate the couple's food, drank their drinks, and explored the personal space of the people they were about to victimize. The recovered security footage would later show them lounging and waiting, their patience a terrifying prelude to the violence they had planned. They were predators lying in wait, and as Huo Jiangyo and Zhang Qingling walked through their front door that evening, they stepped into a meticulously prepared ambush. The life they had so carefully built was about to be systematically and brutally torn apart. The next morning, on May 15th, Jiangyo's mother woke with a familiar sense of routine. Every morning, her son and daughter-in-law would come to her house for breakfast. It was a cherished ritual, a time for family to connect before the day began. But on this morning, they didn't arrive. At first, she felt a pang of annoyance. Perhaps they had simply overslept. She waited. As the minutes turned into an hour, annoyance gave way to a nagging worry. She tried calling Jiangyo's phone. It rang and rang, but there was no answer. She then called Qingling. The result was the same, an unnerving silence on the other end of the line. This was highly unusual. Jiangyo was responsible and devoted. He would never miss their morning meal without letting her know. A cold sense of dread began to creep into her heart. A mother's intuition told her that something was terribly wrong. Unable to wait any longer, she left her home and found another villager, asking for a ride on their electric scooter to her son's house on the edge of the village. As they approached the property, the first unsettling sign was the front gate. It was Owen. The mother's heart pounded in her chest as she walked onto the property, her calls of Jiangyo, tingling, echoing in the morning air, unanswered. The main door to the house was also unlocked. Stepping into the courtyard, she was confronted with the first act of savage violence. The family's dog, their loyal pet, lay dead on the ground. It had been viciously beaten with a blunt object, a silent and brutal testament to the horror that had visited the home. Fighting back panic, she and the villager pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene before them was one of utter chaos. The entire house had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out, and the couple's belongings were thrown carelessly across every room, from the living area to the bedroom. It was a scene of violent upheaval, a clear sign of a desperate and frantic search. But amidst the wreckage, there was no sign of her son or her pregnant daughter-in-law. They were gone. With trembling hands, the mother pulled out her phone and made the call that would officially begin the investigation into one of the most shocking and brutal crimes the region had ever seen. She called the police. When the first police units arrived at the small, isolated house on the edge of Dangjiashuan village, they were met by the frantic and grief-stricken mother of Huo Jiangyo. They entered the home to find the scene of chaos she had described. It was a textbook home invasion, violent and thorough. Every room had been turned upside down, every cabinet and drawer flung open in a frenzied search for valuables. The initial assessment was clear. This was a robbery, but the disturbing, unanswered question that hung in the air was the whereabouts of the home's occupants. With the couple missing and the family dog brutally killed in the yard, investigators immediately escalated the case. This was no longer just a burglary. It was a potential kidnapping and homicide investigation. Forensic teams were called in and began the meticulous process of combing through the wreckage. They dusted for fingerprints, searched for footprints, and carefully documented the state of the home, looking for any clue the perpetrators might have left behind. But the chaos itself was a challenge, making it difficult to isolate trace evidence that could belong to the intruder. As the investigators worked, the primary objective was to build a profile of the victims. They began by conducting extensive interviews, starting with Jiangyo's mother. Through her tears, she recounted her son and daughter-in-law's lives. She told them about their daily routine, their new business, and their excitement over the coming baby. She insisted they were good people, hardworking and kind, with no enemies to speak of. Her testimony was corroborated by others in the village. Friends and neighbors all described the couple in the same glowing terms. They were a young, happy couple focused on their future, not involved in any conflicts or disputes that could explain such a violent attack. This information only deepened the mystery. If not a personal vendetta, then the motive had to be purely financial, which made the disappearance of the couple all the more sinister. The initial hours of the investigation were a frustrating search for leads. Because the house was so isolated, there were no eyewitnesses. No neighbors had heard any screams or sounds of a struggle on the night of May 14th. The perpetrators had chosen their target well, using the privacy the couple cherished against them. With few external leads, investigators turned to the standard procedure in cases like this. They started to trace the couple's financial activity. This is where they got their first major break. A check of Huo Jiangyo and Zhang Qingling's bank account revealed a series of transactions that had occurred after they were last seen. There had been 6 separate cash withdrawals made from an ATM in a nearby town. The total amount taken was 11,000 yuan. This was the proof they needed. The robbery motive was confirmed, and more importantly, the investigation now had a specific time and place where one of the culprits had surfaced. The focus of the entire operation shifted to that single ATM. Detectives immediately requested the surveillance footage from the bank. As they sat down to review the video, they knew this was their best chance to get a look at one of the perpetrators. The footage began to play, and a figure appeared on the screen. It was a young man, his frame slight, possibly a teenager. He was clearly attempting to disguise his identity. A hooded sweatshirt was pulled down low over his face, and he wore baggy clothing that obscured his build. He approached the machine, inserted the card, and began to withdraw cash, transaction after transaction. As the investigators zoomed in, they noticed a bizarre and chilling detail. The clothing the young man was wearing, the loose pants and jacket, seemed out of place. After showing the footage to the victim's family, the horrifying realization dawned on them. The clothes belonged to the missing wife, Zhang Qingling. The perpetrator had deliberately dressed himself in the pregnant woman's clothing, a calculated and twisted act designed to confuse anyone who might see him. They also identified the electric scooter he had used to travel to the ATM. It belonged to Huo Jiangyu. This person had not only stolen the couple's money but also their possessions, using them as props in his effort to evade capture. He was audacious and cold, but he had made a critical mistake. He had allowed himself to be captured on camera. The investigation now had a face, albeit a partially obscured one. The next crucial piece of evidence lay back at the crime scene, within the security camera system the couple had installed for their own protection. At first, it seemed like a den. The perpetrators had been thorough. They had located the digital video recorder, the device that stored all the footage, and had smashed it to pieces, believing they had destroyed the evidence of their crime. To the naked eye, the device was a wreck of shattered plastic and broken circuits. But modern forensics can often salvage data from even the most damaged hardware. The recorder was sent to a specialized lab, where technicians began the painstaking work of trying to recover the contents of the hard drive. Hours turned into days as they carefully pieced together the fragments of data. Finally, they had a breakthrough. They managed to restore several crucial video files from the hours leading up to the couple's return on the night of the 14th. The recovered footage was terrifying. It did not show one intruder, but a group of 4 young men. The video captured them breaking into the house while it was empty. It showed them, with a disturbing sense of casualness, making their way through the home, eating the couple's food, and lounging on their furniture as they waited. They were not rushed. They were patient, lying in wait for their victims to return. The footage confirmed this was a premeditated home invasion, planned and executed by a coordinated group. The police now knew they were not looking for a single suspect, but a pack. With 2 pieces of critical video evidence, ATM footage and the home surveillance video, the investigation gained unstoppable momentum. Every available resource was now dedicated to identifying the young man in Qingling's clothes. Despite the disguise, investigators used image enhancement software and cross-referenced the partial facial images with local databases. Their efforts paid off. They put a name to the face at the ATM, a local youth named Jia Wenfeng. Once the first domino fell, the rest of the group collapsed in quick succession. By examining Jia Wenfeng's known associates and social circles, detectives swiftly identified the other 3 men from the home security footage. The ringleader was identified as Zheng Xinfeng. His main accomplice was Fu Gang. The 3rd member was Zheng Beimin. All 4 were young, unemployed, and known to spend their days and nights at local internet cafes, lost in the world of online gaming. The police had their suspects. They knew their names and their faces. But when they moved in to make the arrests, they discovered the group was gone. Realizing that the ATM withdrawal would eventually lead the police to them, the 4 had packed up and fled. They had left Shandong province entirely. The case had transformed once again. It was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was now a nationwide manhunt for 4 known fugitives, wanted for robbery, kidnapping, and very likely, a double murder. The question was no longer who had committed this terrible crime, but where they were hiding, and what horrifying truth they held about the final hours of Huo Jiangyu and Zheng Qingling. With the names and faces of all 4 suspects now identified, a nationwide manhunt was launched for Zheng Xinfeng, Fu Gang, Zhang Beimin, and Jia Wenfeng. Their images were distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. It was a race against time, not only to bring them to justice but also to discover the fate of Huo Jiangyu and Zheng Qingling. The fugitives, however, were not seasoned criminals. They were a group of desperate young men, and their escape was clumsy and short-lived. Acting on a tip, police tracked them to Liaoning province, hundreds of miles north of their home. A coordinated raid was conducted, and all four were taken into custody without resistance. The manhunt was over. They were promptly extradited back to Fakeson County to face the consequences of their actions. Initially, during interrogation, the suspects were defiant. They maintained a wall of silence, likely believing that without bodies, the police could only prove a robbery. But their resolve crumbled when investigators laid out the evidence against them. They were shown the crystal-clear ATM footage of Jia Wenfeng. They were then shown the recovered footage from the home security camera, a silent film that documented their every move as they broke into the house and lay in wait. Faced with this irrefutable proof, their unified front shattered, and one by one, they began to talk. The confession that spilled out was a story of pure evil, a narrative of cruelty that went far beyond what even the most seasoned detectives had imagined. They admitted to the robbery. They admitted they had ambushed the couple upon their return, but that was only the beginning. They confessed that they had not simply killed their victims. They had held them captive inside their own home, subjecting them to an hours-long ordeal of unimaginable terror. And then, the suspects revealed the final, missing piece of the puzzle. They told the investigators where they had hidden the bodies, in a remote cave not far from the village. Guided by the killers, a team of police officers and forensic specialists made their way to the location. Inside the dark, damp cave, they made the discovery they had been dreading. The bodies of Huo Jianguo and Zhang Qingling were found. The condition of their remains spoke to the sheer brutality of their final hours. The subsequent autopsy would confirm the horrific detail. Both victims had extensive bruising consistent with being beaten with a blunt object, and their wrists bore deep ligature marks from being tied up. The official cause of death for both was determined to be asphyxiation by strangulation. But the autopsy on Zhang Qingling revealed a final, monstrous act of depravity. The examiners confirmed that the pregnant woman had been subjected to a horrific and repeated sexual assault by the group. Through the detailed confessions of the perpetrators, the full timeline of the nightmare was established. The torture, the beatings, and the assaults had gone on for 8 consecutive hours. What began as a home invasion for money had devolved into a prolonged and sadistic spectacle of violence. The case was now officially one of the most savage and heinous multiple homicide cases the province had seen in over a decade. The motive, when it was fully understood, was both shockingly simple and deeply pathetic. The 4 young men were unemployed and addicted to online gaming. Their lives revolved around the virtual worlds of internet cafes, a habit that required a constant flow of cash. They had decided to commit a robbery to get money to fund their addictions. Their choice of target was a fatal miscalculation. They had noticed the new security camera on the couple's isolated house and made a deadly assumption that such a device must be a sign of significant wealth. The very measure Huo Jianguo and Zhang Qingling had taken to protect themselves had, in a tragic twist of irony, made them the focus of the predators. The escalation from robbery to murder was a cold and practical decision made in the midst of the crime. Once the couple had seen their faces, the perpetrators knew they could be identified. They decided to eliminate the witnesses. But this does not explain the 8 hours of torture or the sickening sexual violence. Those acts were not born of practicality. They were born from a profound and disturbing sadism present within the group, particularly in the ringleaders, Zhang Xinfeng and Fu Gang. In their minds, the victims were no longer human beings. They were objects to be used and discarded for their own cruel pleasure and gratification. The subsequent trial at the Intermediate People's Court of Linyi City was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions were detailed, and the public was crying out for justice. The 4 were charged with robbery, intentional homicide, and rape. Given the extreme brutality of the crime and the immense public outrage, the court delivered one of its harshest possible sentences. Zhang Xinfeng, Fu Gang, and Zheng Beimin were all sentenced to death. Jia Wenfeng, the youngest member who had acted as the lookout and withdrawn the money, was spared execution due to his lesser role in the physical murders and his age. He received a sentence of life in prison. While they awaited their executions, their notoriety followed them into the prison system. Other inmates, many of whom were violent criminals themselves, were disgusted by the nature of their crimes, particularly the violation and murder of a pregnant woman. The 3 condemned men became targets. They were relentlessly beaten by fellow prisoners in what was described as a form of prison justice. In his first 6 weeks of incarceration, Fu Gang reportedly lost over 50 pounds from starvation and constant attacks. The assaults were so frequent that guards often turned a blind eye. At one point, the three men attempted a coordinated suicide by smashing their heads against their cell walls, an attempt that was ultimately stopped by guards. On March 22, 2016, the Supreme People's Court approved the death sentences. 3 months later, on June 22, Zhang Xinfeng, Fu Gang, and Zhang Beimin were taken from their cells to an execution ground. The sentences were carried out by lethal injection, bringing a final, legal end to their lives. For the sole survivor, Zhao Wenfeng, the story took another controversial turn. In November 2019, the court reviewed his case and reduced his life sentence to a fixed term of 22 years, citing his good behavior and commitment to reform. However, unconfirmed reports from former inmates alleged a darker reason for his compliance. Rumors suggested that he had been beaten so severely by other prisoners that he was left with significant brain damage, reducing his mental capacity to that of a young child. The impact of the Dangjiaxuan village murders sent a shockwave across China. It ignited fierce national debates on the issues of juvenile crime, the corrupting influence of internet game addiction, and the often overlooked issue of security in rural communities. In the wake of the tragedy, the local government took action. By 2014, CCTV surveillance coverage in the rural areas of Shandong province had increased to over 92%. But for the family of the victims, these changes offered no comfort. Yuo Jiangguo's mother lost her only son, her beloved daughter-in-law, and the grandchild she would never get to hold, all in a single night of senseless violence. Justice was served, but the profound loss left a permanent scar on her heart and on the soul of a quiet village that was forced to confront the darkest depths of human cruelty.